Granite carries silent testimony that refuses every easy conclusion. Monumental architecture, flawless alignments, and encrypted carvings continue to challenge the sharpest archaeological minds, revealing puzzles untouched by certainty. Each remarkable discovery reshapes everything once accepted, replacing confidence with deeper uncertainty. Settle in, keep your curiosity close, and let's uncover the ancient Egypt mysteries that continue to astonish Egyptologists. The royal palace rests in silence as the final glow of evening fades beyond the horizon. Tall limestone walls cast long shadows across polished courtyards, while carefully painted columns support halls reserved for Egypt's highest officials. Guards stand at their posts, servants move through dim corridors with measured steps, and somewhere within these chambers sits one of the most powerful rulers of the Middle Kingdom. Yet, behind the appearance of order, an invisible tension seems to gather. Before dawn arrives, the kingdom's future will change forever. Amenemhat I, founder of Egypt's 12th dynasty, ruled around the early 20th century BC, a period remembered for restoring stability after years of political division. His reign strengthened royal authority, expanded trade, secured Egypt's frontiers, and established a new capital at Akhtoy. Contemporary records portray a capable monarch who transformed the kingdom into one of the strongest states of its age. Even so, the final chapter of his life remains one of ancient Egypt's most debated mysteries. No surviving official inscription plainly records the circumstances of his death. Instead, much of what historians know comes from literary works created during or shortly after the 12th dynasty. Among the most remarkable is the teaching for King Merenre? No, that is unrelated. More significant is the teaching of Amenemhat, a text presented as though the dead king himself speaks to his son, Senusret I. In its haunting words, the ruler describes a violent attack carried out by trusted members of his own household while he rested during the night. The account is striking because it depicts betrayal from within rather than invasion from beyond Egypt's borders. The king warns that loyalty can be fragile, even among those closest to the throne. Although many scholars regard the composition as political literature designed to reinforce Senusret I's legitimacy, its vivid details continue to raise difficult questions. Was the text inspired by an actual assassination, or did later writers transform ordinary succession into dramatic royal propaganda? Another important source, the story of Senusret, provides a subtle clue. It begins with the sudden announcement of Amenemhat's death while Senusret I is away leading a military campaign. The prince immediately abandons the expedition and races home to secure the throne. The urgency described in the narrative suggests more than the passing of an elderly ruler. It hints at instability, uncertainty, and perhaps a struggle unfolding behind palace walls. Modern historians generally consider the possibility that Amenemhat I was indeed murdered by conspirators within the royal court. Such plots were not impossible in ancient Egypt, where succession could create dangerous rivalries among officials, military leaders, and members of the royal family. A coordinated attack during the king's vulnerable moments would explain the swift actions taken by Senusret I and the emphasis later placed upon preserving legitimate rule. Yet, alternative ideas continue to circulate. Some researchers suggest that the assassination account was exaggerated to strengthen the image of Senusret I as the rightful heir who restored order after chaos. Others wonder whether competing factions sought influence over the throne and whether the surviving records deliberately concealed names, motives, and consequences to protect the monarchy's reputation. Since royal inscriptions often celebrated success while avoiding internal failures, important details may have been intentionally omitted from the historical record. There are also more speculative interpretations. A few writers have proposed that the official story masks a larger political purge involving powerful elites whose identities disappeared from surviving monuments. Others point to gaps in the archaeological evidence, asking whether missing records reflect simple loss through time or deliberate removal during later reigns. These possibilities remain difficult to verify, yet they illustrate how incomplete evidence leaves room for continued investigation. Excavations have revealed much about the Middle Kingdom, but the palace where these events unfolded has yielded no definitive answer to the king's final hours. The voices that survive come through carefully copied manuscripts, royal ideology, and fragments shaped by generations of scribes. Each source offers valuable insight while leaving crucial pieces absent. Perhaps that silence is the greatest mystery of all. In a civilization renowned for preserving names, monuments, and memory with extraordinary care, the fate of one of its most influential rulers still lingers between documented history and enduring uncertainty. If the death of Amenemhat I reminds us how easily certainty can dissolve into silence, another royal mystery carries us even farther back in time. Long before the Middle Kingdom reached its height, another palace may have witnessed an equally dramatic turning point, one that still echoes through the oldest surviving monuments of ancient Egypt. Inside the pyramid complex of Pharaoh Teti at Saqqara, the air remains cool despite the relentless sun outside. Narrow corridors descend through carefully cut limestone, leading toward a burial chamber whose walls are covered with some of the earliest pyramid texts ever carved. Thousands of hieroglyphs stretch across the stone, intended to guide a king safely into the afterlife. Every surface reflects extraordinary care, suggesting that Teti expected an eternal journey protected by divine order. Yet, the circumstances surrounding his final moments hint at a far less peaceful ending. Teti ruled at the beginning of Egypt's 6th dynasty, around the 24th century BC. His reign followed a period of political transition, and while later traditions describe him as an established ruler, surprisingly little survives about the final years of his life. Monumental inscriptions celebrate religious rituals, royal authority, and offerings to the gods, but they remain almost completely silent about the events that brought his reign to an end. That silence became especially intriguing centuries later. The Egyptian historian Manetho, writing during the Ptolemaic period, recorded that Teti was murdered by his own bodyguards. Although Manetho lived nearly 2,000 years after Teti himself, his writings preserve traditions that may have originated from much older records now lost. His brief statement is one of the earliest surviving claims that an Egyptian pharaoh fell victim to assassination rather than natural causes. Could such an event truly have happened? Royal bodyguards occupied positions of exceptional trust. They protected the king during ceremonies, military inspections, and private life within the palace. If members of that inner circle turned against the ruler, the attack would have required careful planning and powerful motivation. Such a betrayal raises difficult questions about the political atmosphere surrounding the throne. Modern historians have suggested that internal rivalries may have grown during Teti's reign. Powerful officials increasingly controlled vast estates. Regional governors accumulated influence far from the royal court, and elite families competed for prestige through marriage and political alliances. In such an environment, even the authority of a pharaoh may have faced pressures hidden beneath the appearance of stability. Some researchers point toward the unusually complex succession that followed Teti's death. Several rulers appear within a relatively short period, and parts of the historical record remain uncertain. Names disappear, timelines overlap, and surviving king lists sometimes disagree with archaeological evidence. Although gaps in ancient documentation are not unusual, They leave room for speculation that political upheaval may have accompanied the transition of power. Others argue that Manetho's account should be treated with caution. His history survives only through quotations preserved by later writers, making it difficult to know exactly how his original words were written. It is possible that later generations misunderstood older traditions or combined separate events into a single dramatic story. Without contemporary records confirming an assassination, certainty remains beyond reach. Still, a handful of alternative theories continue to attract attention. Some propose that Teti's death resulted from a broader struggle between competing factions within the royal household. Others wonder whether economic strain or shifting religious loyalties weakened the monarchy enough to encourage a palace conspiracy. A few more speculative interpretations suggest that evidence of political violence may have been deliberately erased by successors eager to present an image of uninterrupted divine rule. Archaeology has revealed magnificent temples, decorated tombs, and the remarkable pyramid texts that transformed royal burial traditions. Yet, none of these discoveries identifies the individuals who may have stood closest to Teti during his final hours. The inscriptions celebrate eternity, but they remain silent about the living people whose decisions may have altered the course of Egyptian history. Perhaps that contrast explains why this mystery continues to endure. A monument built to preserve a king's name for eternity has outlasted countless generations, while the truth behind his death remains concealed somewhere between fragmentary records, fading traditions, and questions that still resist every confident answer. If Pharaoh Teti's uncertain fate reveals how quickly power could shift behind palace walls, the story that follows is even more elusive. In the quiet space between one ruler's death and another's rise stands a figure who appears only briefly in the historical record before fading almost completely from view. His name was Userkare, and his short reign remains one of ancient Egypt's most enduring puzzles. The wind moves gently across the sands of Saqqara, brushing against weathered blocks that have witnessed more than 4,000 years of history. Broken reliefs lie scattered where temples once stood in perfect order, while fragments of inscriptions emerge from the earth only to disappear again beneath layers of dust. Every carved name tells a story, yet some names appear only once or twice before falling into silence. Among them is Userkare, a king whose existence is accepted by historians, but whose identity and purpose remain remarkably uncertain. Userkare is believed to have ruled during the early 6th dynasty, shortly after the death of Teti and before the reign of Pepi I, around the 24th century BC. Unlike many Egyptian pharaohs, he left behind very few monuments that can be confidently linked to his rule. There is no great pyramid that clearly bears his name, no lengthy royal inscription describing his accomplishments, and no surviving account written during his lifetime explaining how he reached the throne. Instead, historians must reconstruct his story from scattered clues. His name appears in several ancient king lists, confirming that later Egyptians regarded him as a legitimate ruler, at least to some extent. Seal impressions bearing his royal name have also been discovered, demonstrating that his administration functioned in an official capacity. Yet, beyond these limited traces, the evidence grows remarkably thin. The scarcity itself has become part of the mystery. One widely accepted theory suggests that Userkare served as a temporary ruler during a period of political uncertainty following Teti's death. If Pepi I was still too young to govern, an experienced official or senior member of the royal family may have assumed power until the rightful heir could take the throne. Such regencies are not unknown in history, although direct evidence for this arrangement in Userkare's case has never been found. Another possibility is far more dramatic. If Teti truly died as the victim of a palace conspiracy, Some historians wonder whether Userkare may have benefited from that crisis. Did he seize the throne with the support of influential officials? Was he connected to rival factions within the royal court? Or did later generations unfairly associate his reign with events he had no part in controlling? The available evidence remains too limited to answer with confidence. Curiously, later monuments commissioned by Pepi I seem to avoid mentioning Userkare altogether. In several royal inscriptions, the sequence of rulers appears to move directly from Teti to Pepi I, as though Userkare had never existed. This omission has led some researchers to suggest that his memory may have been deliberately minimized after his removal from power. Ancient Egyptian rulers occasionally erased the names of predecessors whose legitimacy they wished to challenge, using silence itself as a political tool. Even so, there are reasons for caution. Historical records from the Old Kingdom are often incomplete. Countless monuments have been destroyed, reused as building material, or simply lost beneath centuries of shifting ground. The absence of evidence does not necessarily indicate deliberate suppression. Userkare's brief reign may simply have produced fewer inscriptions, leaving later generations with only fragments of an already limited record. More speculative interpretations continue to circulate among independent researchers. Some propose that Userkare represented a separate branch of the royal family whose claim to the throne was later rejected. Others imagine a peaceful caretaker king whose reputation was unintentionally overshadowed by Pepi I's long and successful reign. A few even suggest that important documents describing this turbulent period may still lie undiscovered beneath unexplored sections of ancient administrative centers or buried temple archives. For now, archaeology offers only isolated pieces of a much larger picture. A seal here, a name in a king list there, and scattered references that resist forming a complete narrative. The spaces between those fragments are almost as significant as the evidence itself, reminding historians how much of Egypt's earliest history survives only in incomplete form. If Userkare's brief appearance demonstrates how a ruler can almost vanish from the historical record, the next mystery goes a step further. Here, the evidence does not merely fade, it seems to stop altogether. A king who unquestionably ruled Egypt simply disappears, leaving behind a trail that ends without explanation. His name was Mentuhotep IV, the last known ruler of the 11th dynasty, and his fate remains one of the most intriguing gaps in ancient Egyptian history. Far beyond the fertile banks of the Nile, the rugged valleys of the eastern desert stretch toward the Red Sea. Jagged cliffs rise above winding tracks carved by generations of quarry workers, soldiers, and royal expeditions. The landscape is harsh, quiet, and remarkably well preserved, holding inscriptions left by travelers nearly 4,000 years ago. Among these weathered carvings appears the name of Mentuhotep IV, a ruler whose presence is unmistakable, yet whose final chapter remains almost completely unknown. Mentuhotep IV is generally believed to have ruled near the end of the 11th dynasty, around the beginning of the 20th century BC. His reign appears to have been relatively brief, and compared with many Egyptian kings, surprisingly few monuments can be confidently attributed to him. What survives instead are scattered inscriptions, quarry records, and references connected to official expeditions that continued operating under royal authority. One of the most significant discoveries comes from Wadi Hammamat, a vital route linking the Nile Valley with valuable stone quarries and ports on the Red Sea coast. An inscription records a remarkably large expedition organized during Mentuhotep IV's reign. Thousands of workers, soldiers, craftsmen, and administrators participated in the mission, demonstrating that the government remained capable of coordinating complex operations. Nothing within the inscription suggests a kingdom collapsing into disorder. Equally significant is the official responsible for leading that expedition. His name was Amenemhat. At the time, Amenemhat served as the king's vizier, the highest-ranking official beneath the pharaoh himself. His responsibilities would have included supervising administration, managing state resources, overseeing construction projects, and advising the royal court. Few could have possessed greater influence within the government. Yet only a short time later, Mentuhotep IV disappears from history. No surviving inscription describes his death. No contemporary account records his abdication. No royal tomb has been identified with certainty. Even more striking, later king lists compiled by Egyptian scribes frequently omit his name altogether, moving directly from the 11th dynasty to the reign of Amenemhat I, founder of the 12th dynasty. That omission has fascinated historians for generations. One straightforward explanation is that Mentuhotep IV died naturally without producing a clear heir. In such circumstances, a capable and experienced official like Amenemhat may have assumed power with the support of influential members of the royal administration. Egypt had experienced political transitions before, and continuity of government would have been essential for preserving stability throughout the kingdom. Another possibility is more complicated. Could Amenemhat have seized the throne? The question does not arise simply because he became king. It also reflects the unusual silence surrounding his predecessor. Amenemhat I founded one of Egypt's greatest dynasties, introducing important political reforms and establishing a new royal capital at Ichtawi. His reign marked the beginning of the prosperous Middle Kingdom. Yet despite these achievements, no surviving inscription openly explains how authority passed from Mentuhotep IV to the new dynasty. Some historians have suggested that the transition may have involved political maneuvering rather than open conflict. If Mentuhotep IV lacked strong support or faced internal opposition, influential officials may have gradually shifted their loyalty toward Amenemhat, whose administrative experience made him an attractive candidate to restore long-term stability. Such a transfer of power might not have required violence at all. Others consider the possibility that the historical record itself was carefully reshaped. Ancient Egyptian rulers often emphasized continuity and divine legitimacy. If Amenemhat wished to present himself as the rightful founder of a new dynasty, minimizing the memory of the previous ruler could have strengthened that narrative. Omitting Mentuhotep IV from later king lists would not necessarily erase his existence, but it could reduce his importance within Egypt's official history. Still, the evidence remains frustratingly incomplete. Unlike famous royal conspiracies described in surviving texts, there are no eyewitness accounts pointing toward assassination or rebellion. Archaeologists have uncovered no definitive proof of a violent overthrow. Instead, the mystery survives because of what is missing rather than what has been found. The absence extends even to Mentuhotep IV's burial place. Nearly every Egyptian king invested enormous resources in preparing for eternity, constructing tombs intended to preserve both body and memory. Yet, no securely identified royal tomb belonging to Mentuhotep IV has ever been discovered. Whether it remains hidden beneath unexplored ground, was dismantled in antiquity, or was never completed at all remains uncertain. Alternative theories continue to emerge from the gaps in the evidence. Some independent researchers propose that Mentuhotep IV died during one of the demanding expeditions into the eastern desert, leaving the kingdom unexpectedly without leadership. Others imagine a palace coup carried out quietly enough to avoid leaving obvious traces in surviving monuments. A few suggest that important archives documenting the transition may still lie buried beneath ancient administrative centers, waiting for excavation to reveal forgotten details. There is also another intriguing possibility. The Egyptians themselves were careful record keepers, but their records served political purposes as well as historical ones. Royal inscriptions celebrated victories, honored the gods, and reinforced legitimate rule. They rarely dwelled on uncertainty, disputed succession, or moments of institutional weakness. If the transition from Mentuhotep IV to Amenemhat I proved politically sensitive, silence may have been considered more valuable than explanation. Today, travelers who stand among the inscriptions at Wadi Hammamat can still read the names of officials who served a king whose story simply ends. Those carved lines remain fixed in stone, surviving storms, shifting sands, and thousands of years of passing time. They confirm that Mentuhotep IV lived, ruled, and commanded the resources of a functioning kingdom. Beyond that, the trail grows unexpectedly cold. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not whether Mentuhotep IV was overthrown, forgotten, or quietly succeeded. It is how an Egyptian pharaoh, whose every action was meant to endure for eternity, could leave behind a history filled less with answers than with carefully preserved silence, inviting each new generation to wonder what vanished from the record before anyone realized it was gone. If the disappearance of Mentuhotep IV reveals how an entire ruler can fade into silence, the years following Pepi II present an even broader mystery. This time, it is not the fate of a single king that disappears into uncertainty, but the identity of those who truly governed one of the world's greatest kingdoms during one of its most turbulent chapters. The ruins of Memphis lie scattered beneath layers of earth accumulated over thousands of years. Broken columns rest where magnificent temples once welcomed royal processions, while fragments of statues emerge from the soil with faces worn smooth by time. These stones witnessed the height of the Old Kingdom, when Egypt's pharaohs commanded vast resources and raised monuments that still dominate the landscape. Yet somewhere among these silent remains, the clear line of royal authority begins to dissolve. Pepi II is remembered as one of Egypt's longest reigning kings, traditionally believed to have ruled for many decades during the 6th dynasty, beginning in the 23rd century BC. His extraordinary reign brought remarkable continuity, but it also created an unusual problem. By the time his rule ended, several generations of officials had risen to power. Provincial governors had strengthened their own influence, and the balance between the throne and local authorities may have shifted dramatically. What happened after his death remains one of ancient Egypt's most debated historical questions. The official king lists preserve the names of several rulers who followed Pepi II, yet the sequence becomes increasingly uncertain. Some kings appear only briefly before disappearing from the record. Others are known solely through damaged inscriptions or isolated archaeological discoveries. The once orderly succession of pharaohs gives way to a confusing landscape filled with missing years, disputed identities, and overlapping claims. Many historians believe Egypt entered what is now known as the First Intermediate Period, a time when centralized royal authority weakened considerably. Rather than a single powerful court directing the kingdom, regional governors, known as nomarchs, appear to have exercised increasing independence within their own territories. These local leaders supervised agriculture, collected taxes, maintained security, and commissioned impressive tombs that reflected their growing prestige. If this interpretation is correct, the pharaoh may have remained an important symbolic figure, while practical authority became divided among powerful provincial families. Yet the situation may not have been identical across the entire country. Evidence from different regions suggests that some local administrations continued functioning efficiently despite the apparent decline of the central government. Trade persisted, religious rituals continued, and large communities adapted to changing political circumstances. Instead of sudden collapse, some researchers envision a gradual redistribution of power that unfolded over many years rather than a single dramatic event. Others focus on the possibility of rival courts competing for legitimacy. As central authority weakened, ambitious leaders may have claimed royal titles while controlling only portions of Egypt. Such competing governments could explain why surviving king lists and archaeological evidence sometimes appear difficult to reconcile. Different regions may have recognized different rulers at the same time. There are also environmental factors to consider. Geological and archaeological studies suggest that periods of unusually low Nile floods may have reduced agricultural production, placing enormous pressure on the state's economic foundations. Food shortages, declining tax revenues, and local competition for resources could have accelerated political fragmentation without requiring a violent revolution. More speculative theories explore possibilities that remain difficult to verify. Some suggest that influential priesthoods gradually assumed greater authority as royal institutions weakened. Others wonder whether wealthy noble families quietly directed political decisions while allowing little-known kings to occupy the throne in name alone. A few researchers even question whether some rulers traditionally listed during this period governed simultaneously rather than consecutively, creating a far more complex political landscape than the surviving records reveal. The challenge lies in the evidence itself. Many monuments from this era have been damaged, reused in later construction, or lost altogether. Royal inscriptions become less abundant, and written records grow increasingly fragmented. Each archaeological discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, yet the complete picture remains frustratingly incomplete. Standing among the weathered remains of Memphis today, it is difficult to imagine that such uncertainty could surround one of history's greatest civilizations. The monuments still proclaim the power of kings, yet the years after Pepi II remind us that authority can fade long before stone begins to crumble. Somewhere within the missing records of Egypt's first intermediate period may lie the answer to who truly guided the kingdom through its most uncertain years, or whether that secret disappeared alongside the people who once held it. If the years after Pepi II reveal how fragile royal authority could become, an earlier episode suggests those cracks may have appeared long before the Old Kingdom entered its decline. Hidden behind the polished walls of the royal residence, a conspiracy was said to have unfolded at the very heart of the Egyptian court, reminding us that the greatest threats to a pharaoh did not always come from distant frontiers, but sometimes from those standing closest to the throne. The remains of the royal complex at Saqqara offer only scattered traces of the bustling world that once surrounded Pharaoh Pepi I. Limestone foundations mark the outlines of courtyards where officials gathered, while fragments of carved reliefs preserve scenes of ceremony, tribute, and royal authority. Everything was designed to project stability. Every procession, every inscription, and every ritual reinforced the idea that the king ruled with divine approval. Yet somewhere within these halls, according to one remarkable source, loyalty may have begun to unravel. Pepi I ruled during the 6th dynasty, around the 23rd century BC, overseeing a kingdom that remained prosperous and influential. His reign witnessed ambitious building projects, expanding trade networks, and growing administrative sophistication. At first glance, surviving monuments portray a confident ruler presiding over an orderly government. Little on stone hints at internal crisis. The strongest evidence for a palace conspiracy comes from an unexpected source, an autobiography. The high official Weni, whose tomb inscription survives at Abydos, recounts one of the most unusual responsibilities ever entrusted to an Egyptian administrator. He explains that the king appointed him to conduct a confidential investigation after accusations emerged involving one of the royal wives. Weni emphasizes that he carried out the inquiry privately, assisted by only a single judge, ensuring that the matter remained hidden from the wider court. Curiously, Weni never identifies the exact nature of the accusations. He does not name the queen involved. He does not describe the evidence presented. He does not explain the verdict or reveal the consequences. Instead, He simply records that the investigation was completed to the king's satisfaction before moving on to other achievements in his career. Those omissions have fascinated historians for generations. Most scholars believe the affair involved a serious political conspiracy within the royal household. Because succession to the throne often depended upon royal marriages and the status of different queens, competition among influential families could become intense. A faction supporting one potential heir might have sought to strengthen its position through intrigue, alliances, or attempts to undermine rivals inside the palace itself. Could the investigation have uncovered plans extending beyond court politics? The surviving inscription never says. Nevertheless, the extraordinary secrecy surrounding the case suggests that the allegations touched the highest levels of royal power. Assigning such an investigation to a trusted official outside the immediate circle of the royal family may have been intended to avoid bias, preserve stability, and prevent dangerous rumors from spreading throughout the kingdom. Some historians caution against imagining a dramatic assassination attempt. The available evidence simply does not support that conclusion. The alleged conspiracy may have centered on succession, influence within the royal household, or violations of court protocol rather than direct violence against the king. Without additional records, the precise objective remains impossible to determine. Others point to the remarkable restraint shown by Weni himself. Ancient Egyptian officials often celebrated their accomplishments in elaborate detail, especially when serving the pharaoh. Yet in this case, he deliberately avoids nearly every fact modern historians would most like to know. Was this discretion an expression of loyalty? Did legal or religious customs require silence? Or were later copies of the inscription intentionally abbreviated to protect reputations long after the participants had disappeared? More speculative interpretations continue to circulate beyond mainstream scholarship. Some suggest that the conspiracy involved several influential court factions competing for control of the future succession. Others wonder whether additional officials participated but were quietly removed from the historical record after the investigation concluded. A few researchers have even proposed that Weni's surviving inscription represents only a carefully edited summary of a much larger inquiry whose official documents have never been found. Archaeology has revealed magnificent pyramids, administrative buildings, and the tombs of powerful nobles who served during Pepi I's reign. Together, they paint the picture of a sophisticated government capable of remarkable achievements. Yet among these enduring monuments survives the brief account of one confidential investigation that raises more questions than it answers. Perhaps that is why the palace plot against Pepi I continues to captivate historians. A trusted official recorded just enough to confirm that something extraordinary occurred within the royal court, but withheld almost every detail that could explain it. Across more than 4,000 years, the silence surrounding that investigation remains nearly as compelling as the event itself, inviting us to wonder what truths were considered too dangerous to preserve in stone. If the quiet investigation during Pepi I's reign reveals how carefully political secrets could be concealed within the palace, the rise of Amenemhat I presents an even greater mystery. Here, the question is not simply whether a conspiracy occurred, but how a man who was not born into the royal line emerged as the founder of one of Egypt's most successful dynasties. The weathered inscriptions of Wadi Hammamat still cling to the dark stone cliffs of Egypt's eastern desert. Carved by royal expeditions nearly 4,000 years ago, they record the names of officials, laborers, and commanders who crossed this unforgiving landscape in search of prized stone for temples and monuments. Among those names appears one that would soon reshape Egyptian history. Before he became pharaoh, he was known simply as Amenemhat, the king's vizier. As vizier under Mentuhotep IV, Amenemhat occupied the highest office beneath the throne. He directed the kingdom's administration, supervised major construction projects, managed state resources, and coordinated important expeditions. Surviving inscriptions present him as an exceptionally capable official whose influence reached nearly every part of the government. Then, almost without warning, the historical record changes. Mentuhotep IV disappears from surviving king lists, and Amenemhat emerges as Egypt's new ruler, founding the 12th dynasty around the beginning of the 20th century BC. The transition marked the end of one royal house and the beginning of another. Yet no contemporary inscription clearly explains how this extraordinary transfer of power took place. The simplest explanation is also the one accepted by many historians. Mentuhotep IV may have died without leaving a strong heir. Faced with the possibility of political instability, leading officials could have supported Amenemhat because of his experience and proven administrative ability. Egypt had endured periods of fragmentation before, and placing an accomplished statesman on the throne may have been viewed as the safest path toward preserving unity. Evidence from Amenemhat's reign certainly suggests that he possessed exceptional political skill. He established a new royal capital at Akhtoy, reorganized the administration, strengthened Egypt's frontiers, and initiated reforms that helped usher in the prosperous Middle Kingdom. These achievements indicate careful planning rather than a government struggling to recover from immediate chaos. Even so, important questions remain unanswered. Later Egyptian literature adds another layer of intrigue. The prophecy of Neferti, composed during the 12th dynasty, describes a future king named Ameni who would restore order after a period of turmoil. Most scholars believe the text served as royal propaganda, written after Amenemhat had already taken power to reinforce the legitimacy of his rule. Rather than predicting the future, it likely presented his kingship as part of a divine plan. Yet the very existence of such a work has prompted debate. Why would a new dynasty invest so much effort in emphasizing its legitimacy if the succession had been entirely straightforward? Was the text merely a celebration of successful leadership, or did it respond to doubts that still lingered among some members of Egyptian society? Some historians believe the transition involved careful political negotiation rather than military conflict. Powerful provincial governors, senior officials, and influential priesthoods may have gradually united behind Amenemhat, recognizing that stable leadership was preferable to uncertainty. In this interpretation, his rise reflected broad political consensus rather than personal ambition alone. Others consider a less peaceful possibility. Because Mentuhotep IV vanished so completely from later records, some researchers have wondered whether his removal from power was more deliberate than surviving evidence reveals. If court factions supported Amenemhat before the previous king's reign had truly ended, the transition may have involved quiet political maneuvering hidden behind the formal language of royal inscriptions. No archaeological discovery has confirmed such a scenario, but neither has it been completely ruled out. More speculative theories reach even further, proposing that important records describing the transfer of power were intentionally omitted or destroyed by later officials seeking to present the new dynasty as unquestionably legitimate. While there is no direct evidence supporting deliberate suppression, Egyptian royal inscriptions were carefully crafted political statements, often highlighting success while leaving uncomfortable events unrecorded. Today, the monuments of the 12th dynasty stand among the greatest achievements of the ancient world, reflecting the strength and stability established under Amenemhat I and his successors. Yet, the remarkable success of his reign has never fully answered the question that surrounds its beginning. Somewhere between the fading inscriptions of Wadi Hammamot, the silence surrounding Mentuhotep IV, and the carefully composed literature celebrating a divinely favored king, the true story of Amenemhat's rise remains just beyond reach, waiting, perhaps, for one overlooked inscription or forgotten archive to illuminate a moment that changed the course of Egyptian history forever. If Amenemhat I's rise illustrates how a new dynasty could emerge from uncertainty, the generations before him present an equally compelling mystery. Long before the Middle Kingdom restored stability, Egypt passed through a period in which kings seemed to appear and disappear with remarkable speed, leaving behind little more than scattered names and unanswered questions. At the edge of Saqqara, broken pyramid stones lie half-buried beneath drifting sand, their polished surfaces worn by thousands of years of wind and heat. Nearby, fragments of royal inscriptions survive only as isolated symbols, separated from the monuments that once gave them meaning. Every carved name represents a ruler who expected eternal remembrance. Yet, for several kings who followed Pepi II, memory itself seems to have faded almost beyond recovery. Pepi II's exceptionally long reign, which began during the 6th dynasty in the 23rd century BC, marked the closing chapter of Egypt's Old Kingdom. By the time he died, the kingdom had changed profoundly. Powerful provincial governors exercised increasing independence. Influential families controlled vast estates, and the authority of the royal court no longer reached every corner of the country with the same certainty it once had. Then, the historical record begins to fragment. Ancient king lists preserve the names of several rulers who succeeded Pepi II, including Merenre II and, according to later tradition, a queen often identified as Nitocris. Beyond those names, however, certainty quickly fades. Contemporary monuments become scarce, inscriptions grow increasingly limited, and archaeological evidence offers only scattered glimpses of a royal succession that remains difficult to reconstruct. One of the greatest challenges for historians is determining how many rulers actually governed during this transitional period. Different king lists disagree with one another, while some names appear in later records without clear support from contemporary archaeology. In some cases, damaged inscriptions preserve only fragments of royal titles, making it impossible to identify the individual they once honored. Did these kings rule for only a few months? Were some regional rulers later mistaken for pharaohs? Or have entire reigns disappeared because the monuments recording them were destroyed long ago? Most historians believe Egypt entered the first intermediate period gradually, rather than through a single dramatic collapse. Central authority weakened over time as provincial leaders assumed greater responsibility for governing their own territories. Local administrations continued collecting taxes, maintaining irrigation systems, and organizing religious ceremonies even while the influence of the royal court diminished. In this environment, some successors of Pepi II may have controlled little beyond the capital itself. Their authority, while legitimate in principle, may have been challenged by regional governors whose practical power had steadily increased over generations. Another factor complicates the picture. Many royal monuments from this era were modest compared with the massive pyramids of earlier centuries. Smaller structures were more vulnerable to erosion, stone reuse, and later construction projects. Entire tomb complexes may have disappeared without leaving substantial archaeological traces. What appears today as an absence of history may partly reflect the simple loss of fragile evidence across 4,000 years. Even the identity of Queen Nitocris remains uncertain. Later, classical writers describe her as a ruler who avenged the murder of her brother before taking her own life. Yet many Egyptologists question whether she ruled at all. Some suggest her name may have originated from a misunderstanding of damaged king lists, while others believe she may represent a real historical figure whose story became transformed through centuries of retelling. More speculative ideas continue to emerge from these gaps. Some researchers wonder whether rival royal families governed different regions simultaneously, each claiming legitimate authority. Others suggest that certain successors may have been deliberately omitted from official records by later dynasties seeking to simplify Egypt's complex political history. Although direct evidence for such deliberate erasure remains limited, the practice of reshaping royal memory was not unknown in ancient Egypt. Today, the silence surrounding Pepi II's successors remains as striking as the monuments that survive from earlier ages. The towering pyramids still proclaim the confidence of the Old Kingdom, yet the rulers who inherited that legacy seem to dissolve into scattered names, broken inscriptions, and uncertain chronology. Somewhere beneath the sands, within an undiscovered tomb or a forgotten archive, the missing chapters of their story may still endure, waiting to reveal who these vanished kings truly were, and why history remembers them only in fragments. If the successors of Pepi II seem to fade into scattered names and broken inscriptions, the dynasties that followed become even more difficult to trace. The story no longer centers on a single forgotten ruler, but on an entire royal line that rose and declined with astonishing speed, leaving historians to piece together a chapter where certainty is remarkably scarce. The remains of Memphis stretch quietly across the floodplain, where fallen temple walls, fractured statues, and weathered stone blocks bear witness to centuries of changing fortunes. Once the undisputed center of royal authority, the city had governed an empire whose influence reached far beyond the Nile Valley. Yet, among its surviving ruins, there is little to explain how that immense power weakened so rapidly. The silence preserved in these stones has become one of the greatest puzzles of Egypt's early history. Following the end of the 6th dynasty, Egypt entered the period traditionally associated with the 7th and 8th dynasties, around the 22nd century BC. Ancient records acknowledge that these dynasties existed, but they reveal surprisingly little about the kings themselves. Many rulers are known only from damaged king lists, isolated seal impressions, or fragments of inscriptions. Some names appear once and are never seen again. The uncertainty begins with the written sources. One of the most famous accounts comes from the historian Manetho, who claimed that the 7th dynasty consisted of 70 kings ruling in 70 days. Modern historians almost universally regard this statement as symbolic rather than literal. It likely reflected political instability instead of providing an exact chronology. Even so, the image has endured because it captures the impression of a government where rulers changed with unusual frequency and authority became increasingly fragile. What caused such rapid decline? The most widely accepted explanation points toward the gradual weakening of central government that had already begun during the closing years of the Old Kingdom. Provincial governors accumulated wealth and influence across generations, often governing their territories with considerable independence. As royal authority diminished, these local leaders became less dependent upon the court at Memphis, reducing the pharaoh's practical control over distant regions. Environmental conditions may also have played an important role. Archaeological evidence and climate research suggest that the Nile experienced periods of unusually low flooding during this era. Since Egypt's agriculture depended upon predictable annual inundation, reduced floods could have led to poor harvests, economic hardship, and increased competition for food and resources. Even a well-organized government would have struggled under such conditions, while an already weakened administration faced even greater challenges. Yet, the archaeological record presents a more complicated picture. Despite political uncertainty, some local communities continued constructing tombs, maintaining religious traditions, and conducting regional administration. Daily life did not simply come to a halt. Instead, power appears to have shifted away from the royal court and toward provincial centers that adapted to changing circumstances. Rather than a sudden collapse, many historians now describe this period as a gradual transformation in how Egypt was governed. Even the royal succession remains uncertain. Several kings of the 8th dynasty left inscriptions confirming their existence, yet their reigns were often brief and geographically limited. Some may have exercised authority only in and around Memphis, while regional rulers elsewhere effectively governed independently. Whether these kings commanded genuine national authority or merely preserved the appearance of a united kingdom remains difficult to determine. Alternative interpretations continue to emerge. Some researchers suggest that rival branches of the royal family competed simultaneously for legitimacy, creating overlapping lines of succession that later scribes struggled to reconcile. Others wonder whether many official records disappeared during later rebuilding projects, leaving historians with only a fraction of what once existed. A few have proposed that later dynasties intentionally simplified this complicated era, compressing decades of political rivalry into shorter king lists that emphasized eventual reunification over prolonged uncertainty. There is also the enduring possibility that historians have underestimated the resilience of this period. The phrase collapse suggests sudden disappearance, yet archaeology increasingly reveals continuity beneath apparent disorder. Temples remained active, local governments continued functioning, and Egyptian culture endured despite the weakening of centralized rule. Perhaps the real mystery is not why these dynasties ended so quickly, but why the civilization itself remained remarkably resilient through years of political fragmentation. Today, the names of many 7th and 8th dynasty rulers survive only as faint marks on damaged stone, their accomplishments almost entirely erased by time. Between those fragments lies a chapter where climate, politics, regional ambition, and historical memory intersect in ways that remain only partly understood. Somewhere beneath Egypt's ancient landscape, another inscription, forgotten archive, or undiscovered monument may still hold the missing pieces that explain why 2 royal dynasties passed so swiftly into history, while the civilization they struggled to govern continued to endure. If the collapse of Egypt's early dynasties reminds us how quickly certainty can dissolve into fragmented history, another mystery shifts our attention from ruined monuments to the words preserved on fragile papyrus. This time, the unanswered questions are not carved into stone, but written in carefully chosen lines that seem to blur the boundary between political memory and prophecy. A faded papyrus rests beneath the soft light of a museum gallery, its dark ink still visible after nearly 4,000 years. The fibers had become brittle with age, yet the elegant hieratic script continues to preserve a voice from Egypt's distant past. Every line was copied by skilled scribes, every symbol placed with remarkable precision. Although the document appears quiet and ordinary, the message it carries has inspired centuries of debate. It speaks of chaos, suffering, and mysterious enemies whose true identity remains uncertain. The text is known today as the Prophecy of Neferti, a literary composition believed to have been written during the reign of Amenemhat I in the early 12th dynasty, around the 20th century BC. Rather than presenting itself as a contemporary account, it is set much earlier, during the reign of Pharaoh Sneferu. In the story, a wise sage named Neferti is summoned before the king and describes a future Egypt overwhelmed by disorder, before the arrival of a ruler who will restore balance and justice. Most Egyptologists agree that the work was not intended as a genuine prediction of future events. Instead, it is widely understood as political literature composed after Amenemhat I had already taken the throne. By placing his rise within a prophetic narrative, the text strengthened the legitimacy of the new dynasty and portrayed the king as the long-awaited restorer of harmony after a troubled age. Yet, one part of the narrative continues to attract particular attention. Among its descriptions of turmoil, the text refers to enemies entering Egypt from the east. Communities are disrupted, borders become vulnerable, and the established order begins to weaken. The language is vivid but remarkably imprecise, No specific kingdom is named. No ruler is identified. The invaders remain shadowy figures whose identity is left almost entirely unexplained. Who were these enemies? One mainstream interpretation suggests that the passage reflects increasing interaction with populations living east of the Nile Delta. During periods of weakened central authority, groups from neighboring regions may have crossed into Egyptian territory seeking trade, pasture, or settlement. Rather than describing a single invasion, the text may combine several historical experiences into a symbolic portrait of instability. Others believe the references are primarily literary rather than historical. In Egyptian writing, foreign lands often represented uncertainty beyond the ordered world maintained by the pharaoh. By describing unnamed outsiders entering Egypt, the author may have been emphasizing the consequences of weak kingship instead of documenting a specific military event. The ambiguity has encouraged further speculation. Some researchers wonder whether the anonymous enemies preserve distant memories of conflicts that were already ancient when the text was written. If earlier records describing those encounters disappeared over time, the author may have inherited only fragments of older traditions, transforming them into a broader warning about political disorder. There are also more unconventional interpretations. A few writers have proposed that the deliberate refusal to identify these outsiders suggests the text concealed sensitive political realities familiar to contemporary readers, but omitted from the surviving copy. Others argue that the enemies function as symbolic forces rather than identifiable peoples, representing internal division, economic hardship, or the gradual breakdown of royal authority disguised through poetic language. The challenge is that the surviving evidence refuses to settle the debate. The prophecy of Neferti survives through later copies rather than its original manuscript, and its literary style blends history, ideology, and symbolism with remarkable skill. Every interpretation finds support in some passages while encountering uncertainty in others. Today, the ancient papyrus remains one of the most fascinating works of Egyptian literature, not because it provides clear answers, but because it preserves carefully crafted uncertainty. The mysterious enemies who move silently through its verses continue to resist precise identification, standing somewhere between history and metaphor. Whether they reflected real events, political imagination, or memories already fading when the text was first composed, their true identity remains hidden, inviting us to wonder how many meanings still lie concealed within words that have survived for nearly 4,000 years. If the prophecy of Neferti leaves us wondering whether carefully chosen words conceal deeper political realities, another mystery from the 12th dynasty shifts our attention from literature to a moment that may have changed the course of Egyptian history forever. This time, the unanswered question is not who threatened the kingdom, but why its future king was hundreds of miles away when his father met his end. The desert trail stretches toward the southern frontier, where jagged cliffs overlook the narrow ribbon of the Nile. Dust rises beneath the footsteps of soldiers returning from a military campaign, while banners flutter in the dry wind. Bronze weapons catch the afternoon light, and messengers move urgently between officers carrying news that cannot wait. Somewhere along this route, far from the royal palace, Crown Prince Senusret receives a message that will alter the future of Egypt. His father, Amenemhat I, is dead. The event is described most vividly in The Story of Senusret, one of the greatest literary works to survive from ancient Egypt. The narrative opens with the sudden announcement of the king's death, while Senusret is leading or accompanying a military expedition. The prince reacts immediately, abandoning the campaign and rushing back toward the capital before many around him even understand what has happened. The speed of his departure suggests urgency far beyond the ordinary death of an aging ruler. Why was the heir to the throne absent at such a critical moment? Historians generally agree that Senusret's presence on campaign was not unusual. Egyptian crown princes frequently gained military and administrative experience before assuming the throne. Leading expeditions demonstrated leadership, strengthened loyalty among soldiers, and reinforced royal authority along Egypt's frontiers. Such assignments prepared future kings for the responsibilities awaiting them. There is another important detail. By the final years of Amenemhat I's reign, Senusret had already been elevated as co-regent. Father and son ruled together for a period, sharing authority in a system designed to ensure a stable succession. This arrangement reduced the risk of political uncertainty if one ruler died unexpectedly. On the surface, it appears to have been an effective solution, yet questions remain. If the co-regency was established specifically to guarantee continuity, why was Senusret not present at court during such a sensitive period? Was his military expedition simply part of normal royal duties, or did it serve another purpose altogether? One widely accepted explanation is practical. Egypt's southern frontier required regular military attention, and sending the co-regent to lead or oversee an expedition projected confidence throughout the kingdom. With the succession already secured through joint rule, Amenemhat may have considered the arrangement entirely safe. However, the literary sources introduce subtle hints that have encouraged deeper investigation. In The Teaching of Amenemhat, the deceased king describes being attacked unexpectedly by members of his own household while resting at night. Most scholars interpret the work as political literature intended to reinforce Senusret's legitimacy, but it nonetheless portrays a violent and unexpected assault occurring while the heir was away from the palace. Was that separation merely coincidental? Some historians believe it was. A military campaign already underway would have been difficult to interrupt without compelling reason, and there is no surviving evidence indicating that Senusret anticipated danger before receiving news of his father's death. Others wonder whether the timing deserves closer attention. If factions within the royal court intended to strike against Amenemhat, removing the heir from the capital would have reduced immediate resistance. Whether this happened deliberately or simply reflected fortunate timing for the conspirators remains impossible to determine. No contemporary inscription directly connects Senusret's absence with the events unfolding inside the palace. Another possibility focuses less on conspiracy and more on communication. Ancient Egypt possessed an impressive administrative system, but messages still required time to travel. The prince may have been informed only after events had already concluded, explaining both the urgency of his return and the confusion reflected in literary accounts such as the story of Senusret, where news spreads rapidly but unevenly among those accompanying the expedition. More speculative interpretations continue to emerge. Some researchers have suggested that Senusret's campaign was intended to display military strength while political tensions quietly developed at court. Others imagine that trusted advisors intentionally kept him away until the succession could be secured, protecting both the future king and the stability of the kingdom. These ideas remain unproven, yet they persist because the surviving evidence leaves important gaps. What makes the mystery especially compelling is that Senusret's return appears to have been remarkably swift and successful. Whatever uncertainty followed Amenemhat's death, the prince assumed full control and went on to become one of the most accomplished rulers of the Middle Kingdom. His reign brought military success, architectural achievement, and lasting political stability. The transition, at least from the perspective of surviving history, ultimately succeeded. Yet, the moments immediately preceding that transition remain frustratingly obscure. The desert roads, the hurried messengers, the silent palace, and the sudden departure of a future king all survive only through fragments of literature and scattered historical clues. Somewhere between those fragments lies the answer to why Senusret was absent during one of the most critical nights in Egypt's history, and whether that absence was simply the routine duty of a crown prince or part of a larger story that has yet to be fully uncovered. If Senusret I's unexpected absence reminds us how quickly the trail of evidence can fade at a decisive moment, the next mystery carries us into an even deeper layer of uncertainty. Here, historians are not only left asking how a king died, but whether the fragments that mention him tell the complete story at all. Among the fading names of Egypt's earliest rulers, few are as elusive as Neferirkare II. The surface of an ancient limestone block catches the morning light, its carved hieroglyphs softened by centuries of erosion. Nearby, broken seal impressions and scattered fragments of inscriptions rest in museum collections, each preserving only a handful of symbols from a much larger past. Many royal names survive on towering monuments visible for miles. Others endure only because a scribe copied them onto a damaged list before the original record disappeared forever. Neferirkare II belongs to that second category, a ruler whose existence is acknowledged, yet whose life remains almost entirely concealed. Neferirkare II is generally associated with the closing years of the Old Kingdom, or the beginning of the First Intermediate Period, around the 22nd century BC. He is known primarily from later king lists and a small number of surviving references, but unlike Egypt's better documented pharaohs, he left behind no great pyramid confidently linked to his reign, no lengthy royal inscription celebrating victories, and no contemporary narrative describing his final years. That silence has transformed his reign into one of ancient Egypt's most persistent historical puzzles. Most historians believe Neferirkare II ruled during a time when central authority had already begun to weaken. Following the long reign of Pepi II, Egypt experienced increasing political fragmentation, with provincial governors exercising greater independence while the royal court struggled to maintain influence across the kingdom. In such an environment, some kings may have held authority only briefly before being replaced by rivals or overshadowed by regional powers. If Neferirkare II belonged to this turbulent era, his limited historical footprint becomes easier to understand. A short reign would have provided little opportunity to commission major monuments or leave extensive inscriptions. Many official projects may never have progressed beyond their earliest stages before political circumstances changed once again. Yet, this explanation raises another question. If his reign was brief but legitimate, why do so few traces survive? One possibility is simply the passage of time. Egypt's monuments have endured remarkably well, but countless smaller structures have been dismantled, buried, or reused as building material over thousands of years. Administrative papyri, wooden objects, and painted inscriptions were especially vulnerable to decay. Entire chapters of Egyptian history have likely disappeared through ordinary erosion alone. Another possibility involves the complicated politics of succession. Ancient Egyptian rulers carefully shaped how future generations would remember them. Kings sometimes emphasized continuity, while minimizing predecessors whose legitimacy was disputed or whose reigns proved unsuccessful. If Neferirkare II governed during a contested transition, later dynasties may have focused attention on rulers who better supported their own version of history. Such omissions did not necessarily erase a king completely, but they could reduce his visibility within the surviving historical record. Some researchers have also pointed to the uncertainty surrounding the king lists themselves. Documents such as the Turin King List and the Abydos King List were compiled centuries after many of the events they describe. Although they preserve invaluable historical information, They also contain damaged sections, missing names, and occasional differences in sequence. Could Neferirkare II's position within those lists reflect a reign that has been only partly preserved? Or might later scribes have combined, misplaced, or abbreviated information that originally offered a clearer picture? More speculative interpretations continue to emerge from these unanswered questions. Some independent researchers suggest that Neferirkare II may have ruled only part of Egypt, while rival kings controlled other regions simultaneously. Others imagine that his reign ended abruptly through internal conflict before official monuments could be completed. A few even wonder whether undiscovered administrative archives, still buried beneath ancient settlement mounds, might contain correspondence capable of revealing who he truly was and how his rule came to an end. For now, archaeology offers only scattered pieces of evidence. A name preserved in a royal list, a handful of references separated by centuries. Fragments that confirm his place in Egypt's long succession of rulers, while revealing almost nothing about the man himself. Perhaps that is what makes Neferirkare II so compelling. Unlike famous pharaohs whose monuments dominate the landscape, his story survives largely through absence. The missing tomb, the missing inscriptions, the missing account of his final days, all leave behind a silence that has endured for more than 4,000 years. Somewhere beneath Egypt's ancient sands, another carved stone or forgotten archive may still be waiting to explain how a king could briefly hold one of history's greatest thrones before fading almost completely from memory. If the faint traces left by Neferirkare II remind us how easily an Egyptian king can slip into obscurity, the next mystery unfolds on a much larger stage. Instead of searching for one forgotten ruler, we find an entire kingdom divided between competing centers of power, where victory, defeat, and even the true course of events remain partly hidden behind fragmented records. The Nile flows quietly through Upper Egypt, reflecting towering cliffs and fertile fields that have sustained communities for thousands of years. Far to the north, another stretch of the river winds past the ancient city of Herakleopolis, once a thriving political center. Between these distant capitals, boats carried officials, merchants, soldiers, and messengers through a land no longer united beneath a single, unquestioned throne. Every mile of the river connected rival ambitions, while every settlement found itself drawn into a struggle that would reshape Egypt's future. By the beginning of the First Intermediate Period, around the 22nd and 21st centuries BC, the centralized authority of the Old Kingdom had weakened dramatically. Provincial governors had become increasingly independent, local elites controlled growing resources, and the royal court at Memphis no longer possessed the influence it once enjoyed. From this political transformation emerged two powerful centers that each claimed the right to govern Egypt. In the north stood Herakleopolis, ruled by kings traditionally associated with the 9th and 10th dynasties. In the south, the city of Thebes gradually expanded its authority under the rulers of the 11th dynasty. Each court presented itself as the legitimate guardian of Egyptian order, yet neither initially possessed complete control over the country. The surviving evidence suggests that this rivalry lasted for generations. Royal inscriptions from Thebes celebrate military campaigns and expanding influence, while archaeological discoveries indicate that Herakleopolis remained an important political and economic center throughout much of the conflict. Yet, remarkably few contemporary accounts describe the war itself in detail. There are no surviving battlefield reports, no comprehensive royal chronicles, and no clear timeline explaining how control shifted from one dynasty to the other. Instead, historians must reconstruct the conflict from scattered inscriptions, tomb biographies, and later literary works. One important source comes from the tombs of provincial officials who served the Theban rulers. These inscriptions describe campaigns into northern territories, the capture of strategic settlements, and the growing confidence of southern armies. While they offer valuable information, they also reflect the perspective of those who ultimately emerged victorious. Like many royal records, they emphasize success while remaining largely silent about setbacks. What then was happening on the other side? The kings of Herakleopolis left comparatively few records explaining their own strategy or describing how they viewed the struggle. Whether this reflects the later loss of monuments or the deliberate disappearance of historical evidence remains uncertain. Without both perspectives, historians are left examining only part of a much larger story. Some researchers believe the conflict was not a single prolonged war, but a series of regional campaigns interrupted by periods of uneasy coexistence. Trade appears to have continued along parts of the Nile. Local governments remained active, and many communities adapted to shifting political circumstances rather than experiencing constant warfare. In this interpretation, the rivalry unfolded gradually, with diplomacy proving almost as important as military strength. Others suggest that alliances with provincial governors may have determined the outcome more than battles themselves. Powerful local families controlled agricultural wealth, labor, and regional security. Their decisions regarding loyalty could strengthen one dynasty while quietly weakening another without the need for large-scale confrontation. More speculative ideas explore the possibility that the historical record intentionally simplifies a far more complex political landscape. Some independent researchers propose that additional regional rulers exercised influence alongside both major dynasties, creating overlapping spheres of authority that later king lists compressed into a simpler narrative. Others wonder whether important archives from Herakleopolis remain undiscovered beneath layers of later occupation, preserving accounts that could dramatically reshape our understanding of the conflict. One of the most intriguing aspects of this period is how completely the victorious Theban dynasty eventually reunited Egypt under Mentuhotep II. His achievements are well documented, and later generations celebrated him as the ruler who restored national unity. Yet, success often shapes historical memory. Victorious kings commission monuments, preserve official records, and define how future generations remember the past. Those who lose rarely enjoy the same opportunity. Today, the ruins of both Thebes and Herakleopolis stand as quiet reminders of a struggle whose full story has never been recovered. Broken inscriptions, damaged tombs, and scattered archaeological discoveries reveal moments of conflict, but leave the broader narrative incomplete. Somewhere beneath the ancient cities that once faced one another across a divided kingdom, forgotten records may still rest beneath layers of earth, waiting to reveal whether Egypt's reunification was won primarily through battle, negotiation, or a combination of both that history has yet to fully uncover. If the struggle between Thebes and Herakleopolis reveals how divided Egypt had become, another mystery emerges from the northern kingdom itself. Beyond the battles and shifting frontiers stood a line of rulers who claimed the throne with confidence, yet whose identities, achievements, and even the order of their reigns remain among the most difficult puzzles in Egyptian history. The ancient ruins of Herakleopolis rest quietly beside the Nile, where layers of mud brick walls lie buried beneath centuries of earth and cultivation. Fragments of statues emerge only occasionally during archaeological excavations, while broken pottery and weathered inscriptions hint at a city that once rivaled the greatest centers of Egyptian power. Unlike the towering temples of later dynasties, much of Herakleopolis has disappeared beneath time, leaving only scattered clues to the ambitions of the kings who once ruled from its palaces. During the First Intermediate Period, around the 22nd and 21st centuries BC, Herakleopolis became the capital of the 9th and 10th dynasties. From this city, its rulers claimed authority over much of northern Egypt, while the rising dynasty at Thebes gradually strengthened its influence in the south. For generations, two royal courts existed simultaneously, each presenting itself as the rightful guardian of Egypt's ancient traditions. Yet, the rulers of Herakleopolis remain remarkably elusive. Many are known only through damaged king lists compiled centuries after they lived. Ancient documents preserve names that are incomplete, difficult to read, or appear in conflicting sequences. Some kings may have ruled for only a short time before being replaced by relatives or rivals. Others may have governed simultaneously over different territories during periods of political instability. The result is a royal succession that continues to challenge historians. Among the most frequently discussed rulers is Khety, a name shared by several kings of the 9th and 10th dynasties. Determining which historical events belong to which Khety has proven exceptionally difficult. Ancient sources occasionally mention the name without providing enough detail to distinguish one ruler from another. As monuments disappeared and records became damaged, separate reigns may have gradually merged together within later traditions. One later account, preserved by the historian Manetho, describes a king named Khety as violent and unstable before meeting a dramatic end. According to the story, he was driven mad and killed by a crocodile. Modern historians approach this account with considerable caution. Manetho wrote nearly 2,000 years after the events he described, and his original work survives only through quotations preserved by later authors. Many scholars suspect that the tale reflects symbolism, political criticism, or literary tradition rather than a literal historical event. Still, its survival raises an intriguing question. Why did such an unusual story become attached to one of Herakleopolis's rulers? Some researchers believe later Egyptian traditions may have exaggerated or transformed the reputation of northern kings after Thebes achieved victory and reunified the country. History is often written by those who prevail, and unfavorable portrayals of defeated dynasties are not uncommon throughout the ancient world. If so, stories emphasizing instability or poor leadership may tell us as much about later political memory as they do about the rulers themselves. Archaeology offers a more balanced perspective, though it remains incomplete. Evidence suggests that Herakleopolis continued functioning as an important administrative and religious center throughout much of the First Intermediate period. Local government remained active. Trade networks continued operating, and significant building projects appear to have taken place despite the broader political rivalry with Thebes. These discoveries challenge older assumptions that the Northern Kingdom was defined solely by decline and disorder. Even so, important mysteries remain unresolved. How much territory did the Herakleopolitan kings actually control? Were they recognized across northern Egypt, or did their influence fluctuate as alliances shifted among provincial governors? Without detailed contemporary chronicles, historians must rely upon scattered inscriptions, regional archaeology, and indirect references preserved in later texts. Some scholars argue that the rivalry between Herakleopolis and Thebes has been oversimplified. Rather than two clearly defined kingdoms, Egypt may have consisted of numerous regional powers whose loyalties changed over time. In this interpretation, the kings of Herakleopolis governed through negotiation as much as military force, balancing relationships with influential local families whose support proved essential for maintaining authority. More speculative theories extend even further. Some independent researchers propose that undiscovered royal archives still lie beneath the ancient city, containing administrative records capable of clarifying the succession of its rulers. Others suggest that later rebuilding, natural flooding, and continuous occupation concealed important palace complexes that have yet to be excavated.
If such discoveries are ever made, they could reshape our understanding of one of Egypt's least documented dynasties. There is also the enduring mystery of historical silence. Compared with the monuments commissioned by later Middle Kingdom pharaohs, the rulers of Herakleopolis left surprisingly little that speaks directly in their own voices. Whether this resulted from political defeat, the destruction of monuments, or the simple passage of time remains impossible to determine with certainty. Today, the quiet landscape surrounding ancient Herakleopolis reveals few signs that it once served as the capital of rival kings who challenged for control of an entire civilization. Beneath cultivated fields and buried foundations may rest inscriptions, official correspondence, or forgotten tombs capable of filling the many gaps that still separate historians from the truth. Until then, the rulers of Herakleopolis remain suspended between documented history and enduring uncertainty, remembered not only for the kingdom they governed, but for the remarkable number of questions that continue to surround their reigns after more than 4,000 years. If the rival kings of Herakleopolis remind us how incomplete the history of Egypt's divided kingdoms remains, the rise of the ruler who finally reunited the country presents another mystery just as compelling. Mentuhotep II would eventually become one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs, yet the earliest years of his reign seem to emerge from an unexpected silence, as though history preserved the triumph while allowing its beginning to fade into shadow. The cliffs of Deir el-Bahri rise above the western bank of the Nile like immense natural walls, glowing gold beneath the morning sun. At their base stands the funerary complex of Mentuhotep II, a monument unlike any built before it. Broad terraces climb toward the towering limestone face, while long colonnades frame a sacred space intended to celebrate a king who restored unity to Egypt. Visitors often admire the architecture without realizing that the monument reveals far more about the ruler's later achievements than the uncertain years that first brought him to power. Mentuhotep II ruled during the 11th dynasty, around the 21st century BC. He is remembered as the king who reunited Egypt after generations of political division, bringing an end to the First Intermediate Period and laying the foundations for the Middle Kingdom. His victories over the rulers of Herakleopolis transformed him into one of the defining figures of Egyptian history. Yet remarkably little is known about the beginning of his reign. Unlike many later pharaohs whose earliest years are documented through inscriptions, ceremonial monuments, and administrative records, Mentuhotep II enters the historical record gradually. The surviving evidence provides only scattered glimpses of his early rule, leaving historians to reconstruct events from inscriptions carved years after they occurred. One reason for this uncertainty lies in the political landscape he inherited. When Mentuhotep II ascended the throne at Thebes, Egypt remained divided. The kings of Herakleopolis controlled much of the north, while numerous provincial governors exercised considerable independence throughout the country. Rather than inheriting a unified kingdom, the young ruler governed only part of Egypt. His authority, although legitimate within Thebes, was limited by the realities of a fractured political world. Some historians believe his earliest years were devoted primarily to consolidating control within Upper Egypt. Strengthening alliances with regional officials, securing trade routes, and organizing military resources may have required years of careful planning before any major campaign against the Northern Kingdom became possible. If so, the apparent silence surrounding his early reign may simply reflect a period of preparation rather than dramatic events. The archaeological evidence offers subtle support for this interpretation. The earliest inscriptions associated with Mentuhotep II emphasize traditional royal authority within the territories already under his control. Only later do surviving monuments begin celebrating broader military successes and the reunification of Egypt. This gradual change in royal titles and official imagery suggests that his ambitions expanded over time as his position became more secure. Even so, important questions remain unanswered. How old was Mentuhotep II when he became king? Did experienced advisors guide the government during his first years on the throne? Were there early military setbacks that later inscriptions deliberately ignored? Ancient Egyptian monuments typically celebrated victories while remaining silent about defeats, making it difficult to reconstruct the full sequence of events. Another mystery concerns the pace of his rise. The eventual reunification of Egypt was not the result of a single decisive battle. Evidence suggests that the process unfolded over many years, involving diplomacy, shifting alliances, and repeated campaigns. Yet the surviving inscriptions rarely describe these gradual developments in detail. Instead, they present the restored unity of Egypt as the natural outcome of the king's divine authority. Could that carefully crafted image conceal a far more complicated beginning? Some researchers believe it might. The first years of Mentuhotep II's reign may have been marked by political uncertainty, negotiations with influential governors, and periods during which the outcome remained far from certain. If later royal inscriptions sought to project confidence and inevitability, they may have deliberately simplified the long and difficult road toward reunification. More speculative interpretations explore the possibility that valuable records from his early reign have simply not survived. Administrative archives written on papyrus were especially vulnerable to decay, while smaller monuments could easily have been dismantled during later construction. Entire chapters documenting his first years may have disappeared through ordinary loss rather than intentional destruction. Others wonder whether undiscovered archaeological sites in Upper Egypt still conceal evidence capable of reshaping this period entirely. Buried administrative centers, military outposts, or tombs belonging to senior officials could preserve inscriptions describing events that never reached the monumental temples built after victory had already been achieved. There is also the intriguing question of memory itself. Later generations celebrated Mentuhotep II as the king who restored order after an age of division. Such a reputation naturally focused attention on his greatest accomplishment rather than the uncertain years that preceded it. History often remembers the moment of success while overlooking the long and uncertain path leading toward it. Today, visitors standing beneath the towering cliffs of Deir el-Bahri encounter a monument dedicated to triumph, stability, and royal power. Yet behind its elegant columns lies the story of a ruler whose earliest years remain surprisingly difficult to recover. Somewhere between the fragmented inscriptions of Upper Egypt, the forgotten records of provincial officials, and the monuments still hidden beneath the desert landscape, the missing opening chapter of Mentuhotep II's reign may still survive, waiting to reveal how one of Egypt's greatest kings first began the journey that would reunite an entire civilization. If the earliest years of Mentuhotep II remain hidden behind fragmented records and missing inscriptions, the story naturally leads to the ruler who came before him. Before Egypt could be reunited, before the Theban kingdom expanded beyond Upper Egypt, another king quietly disappeared from history. His reign helped prepare the foundations of a new era, yet the circumstances surrounding his death remain among the least understood chapters of the 11th dynasty. The saf-colored cliffs of El Tarif rise above the western bank of the Nile, their steep faces overlooking a vast royal necropolis carved into the desert. Unlike the towering pyramids of earlier centuries, the tombs here appear modest from a distance, blending almost seamlessly into the surrounding landscape. Wind carries fine grains of sand across weathered entrances, while broken fragments of limestone rest where elaborate funerary monuments once stood. Hidden within this quiet valley are the resting places of the Intef kings, rulers whose ambitions transformed Thebes from a regional power into the kingdom that would eventually reunite Egypt. Among them was Intef III. Although his reign was relatively brief, Historians generally regard Intef III as one of the most important rulers of the late 11th dynasty. He inherited a kingdom that had already begun expanding under his predecessors, strengthening Theban influence while the rival rulers of Herakleopolis continued to dominate much of northern Egypt. Rather than presiding over a peaceful and unified country, Intef III governed during an era defined by political competition, shifting alliances, and the constant possibility of military conflict. Yet, despite his importance, remarkably little survives to describe the final chapter of his life. Unlike later Egyptian kings whose deaths were recorded in inscriptions or whose funerary preparations are well documented, Intef III left behind only scattered evidence. His tomb at El Tarif confirms his royal status, while inscriptions preserve his name and titles, but no contemporary account explains how his reign ended. There is no official statement describing illness, no surviving narrative of battle, and no clear record of a succession crisis. Instead, the historical trail simply grows quiet. The transition itself appears orderly. After Intef III's death, his son, Mentuhotep II, succeeded him and continued the Theban struggle against Herakleopolis. On the surface, this smooth succession suggests that no major political upheaval accompanied the change of rulers. Egyptian governments depended heavily upon continuity, and a peaceful transfer of power would have strengthened confidence among officials, military commanders, and provincial governors. Yet appearances can be deceptive. Ancient Egyptian royal inscriptions rarely emphasized uncertainty. Their purpose was to project divine order rather than reveal moments of vulnerability. If difficulties surrounded the king's final days, official monuments would have offered little reason to preserve them. This silence leaves historians asking whether the transition was truly as straightforward as it now appears. One widely accepted explanation is that Intef III died of natural causes after a relatively short reign. Life expectancy in the ancient world was unpredictable, and even kings remained vulnerable to disease, infection, or sudden illness beyond the reach of contemporary medicine. Without surviving medical evidence or detailed written accounts, this remains one of the simplest possibilities. Even so, the political climate encourages further questions. Intef III ruled while Egypt remained divided between competing dynasties. Military operations along contested frontiers were an expected part of royal responsibility, and regional alliances could shift rapidly. Could the king have died during a campaign? Might an injury sustained in battle have ended his life away from the royal court? No surviving inscription confirms such an event, but neither does the evidence entirely exclude it. Another possibility focuses on the pressures within the royal household itself. Succession was among the most sensitive issues in ancient Egyptian politics. Ensuring a stable inheritance often required balancing influential officials, military leaders, members of the royal family, and powerful provincial governors. Although there is no direct evidence of conspiracy surrounding Intef III, historians recognize that transitions between rulers could become periods of uncertainty, particularly during times of prolonged conflict. If disagreements arose behind palace walls, they may never have reached the monuments intended for public display. Archaeology provides only limited assistance. Intef III's burial site has yielded valuable information about 11th dynasty funerary practices, but it offers few clues regarding the circumstances of his death. Unlike royal mummies from later periods that occasionally preserve evidence of disease or injury, no surviving remains can answer the questions surrounding his final days. The physical evidence that might once have existed has either been lost or has yet to be discovered. Some scholars instead examine the broader political landscape. They suggest that Intef III's greatest achievement may have been securing sufficient stability for his son to inherit a functioning kingdom. The administrative foundations, military organization, and regional alliances developed during his reign likely contributed significantly to Mentuhotep II's eventual reunification of Egypt. If this interpretation is correct, Intef III's legacy survives less through dramatic monuments than through the strength of the state he passed to the next generation. Still, there are aspects that remain difficult to explain. The surviving inscriptions from his reign are comparatively limited when measured against the importance of the dynasty he represented. Were additional monuments destroyed during later centuries? Did the extensive building projects of Mentuhotep II overshadow the accomplishments of his father? Or did the political realities of the time simply leave fewer opportunities to commission lasting records? These uncertainties have inspired more speculative ideas beyond mainstream scholarship. Some independent researchers have wondered whether Intef III's death occurred earlier or more suddenly than historians currently believe, requiring advisors to move quickly in securing the succession of the young Mentuhotep II. Others imagine that local uprisings or regional disputes accompanied the transition, but were intentionally omitted from official inscriptions to preserve the image of uninterrupted royal authority. A few even suggest that undiscovered tombs belonging to senior court officials may contain autobiographical inscriptions capable of describing events that royal monuments deliberately ignored. Such possibilities remain unverified, yet they illustrate how incomplete evidence naturally encourages continued investigation. There is another intriguing aspect to this mystery. Intef III occupies a curious position in Egyptian history. He ruled immediately before one of the civilization's greatest monarchs, yet history remembers the son far more vividly than the father. Mentuhotep II's reunification of Egypt transformed him into a legendary figure, while the ruler who prepared the conditions for that achievement gradually faded into relative obscurity. In many ways, Intef III became overshadowed by the success that followed his own reign. Today, the winds still sweep across the royal necropolis at El Tarif, moving through entrances carved into the desert more than 4,000 years ago. The cliffs remain unchanged, guarding tombs that preserve names but reveal few personal stories. Somewhere beneath the silent stones may still lie overlooked inscriptions, forgotten burial goods, or hidden chambers capable of illuminating the final days of a king whose quiet disappearance helped shape the future of Egypt. Until such evidence emerges, the death of Intef III remains suspended between history and mystery, inviting us to consider how many decisive moments in the ancient world passed into silence before anyone thought to record them. If the quiet disappearance of Intef III reminds us how easily an important ruler can fade behind the achievements of those who followed, another king presents an even more elusive mystery. This time, historians are not simply uncertain about the circumstances of a death or the events of a reign. They continue to debate the ruler's very identity, separating fragments of history from traditions written centuries later. At the center of that uncertainty stands King Wahkare Khety. The ancient mounds of Herakleopolis rise gently from the Nile floodplain, concealing the remains of palaces, temples, workshops, and administrative buildings beneath layers of earth accumulated over 4,000 years. Broken mud brick walls disappear beneath cultivated fields, while occasional fragments of carved limestone emerge during excavations, offering brief glimpses into a city that once claimed authority over much of northern Egypt. Unlike the monumental ruins of Luxor or Saqqara, Herakleopolis reveals its past reluctantly. Every discovery answers one question while opening several more. Among the names connected with this forgotten capital, few are as intriguing as Wahkare Khety. His throne name appears in ancient sources, yet the man behind it remains remarkably difficult to define. Most Egyptologists associate Wahkare Khety with the 10th dynasty, during the First Intermediate period, around the 21st century BC. This was an era when Egypt was divided between competing royal courts, regional governors exercised growing independence, and political authority shifted constantly between alliances that are only partly preserved in the archaeological record. Unlike famous pharaohs whose monuments dominate the landscape, Wahkare Khety survives through scattered traces. His name appears in king lists and is widely linked with one of ancient Egypt's most important literary works, the Instruction for King Merenre. This remarkable text presents an aging king advising his son and successor on the responsibilities of leadership. It discusses justice, administration, diplomacy, military restraint, and the delicate balance required to govern a divided kingdom. Rather than celebrating conquest alone, the work emphasizes wisdom, careful judgment, and measured rule. Many scholars believe the speaker in this composition represents Wahkare Khety. If that identification is correct, the text offers an unusually thoughtful portrait of kingship during one of Egypt's most uncertain periods. Instead of presenting an invincible ruler, it depicts a monarch deeply aware of political instability and the consequences of poor leadership. The advice repeatedly encourages moderation, warning against unnecessary violence while stressing the importance of maintaining order through fairness as well as strength. Yet even here, uncertainty remains. Was the text actually written during Wahkare Khety's lifetime? Most Egyptologists believe the Instruction for King Merenre probably reached its final written form somewhat later, although it may preserve older traditions originating within the Herakleopolitan court. Like many Egyptian literary compositions, it blends practical guidance with political ideals, making it difficult to distinguish historical memory from carefully crafted instruction. The king himself remains frustratingly difficult to reconstruct. No securely identified royal tomb has been discovered. No extensive series of contemporary inscriptions records his campaigns or construction projects. Even the exact sequence of the Khety rulers remains uncertain because several kings shared the same name during the 9th and 10th dynasties. Distinguishing one Khety from another has challenged historians for generations. Some rulers may have governed only briefly. Others may have ruled simultaneously over neighboring territories. Damaged monuments and incomplete king lists further complicate the picture, leaving researchers to compare fragments that rarely fit together perfectly. The political environment of Wahkare Khety's reign adds another layer of mystery. Herakleopolis controlled much of northern Egypt, while Thebes steadily expanded its influence in the south. Neither kingdom initially possessed unquestioned authority over the entire country. Provincial governors retained considerable independence, local alliances shifted over time, and the balance of power remained fragile. In such circumstances, a king's success depended upon far more than military strength. Diplomacy, negotiation, and administrative skill may have been just as important as battlefield victories. If the Instruction for King Merenre reflects genuine political experience, it suggests that Wahkare Khety understood this reality well. The text repeatedly urges careful treatment of subjects and emphasizes that lasting authority cannot rest upon force alone. Was this advice born from hard-earned experience? Did the king witness internal revolts, shifting loyalties, or regional crises that never reached official monuments? The surviving evidence does not provide definitive answers, but the tone of the composition has encouraged historians to consider that possibility. Another intriguing question concerns the relationship between literature and history. Ancient Egyptian instructional texts often served political purposes while also conveying moral principles. If the work attributed to Wahkare Khety was intended to strengthen the legitimacy of his successor, certain events may have been emphasized while others were deliberately omitted. Royal failures rarely received detailed attention in official writings, particularly if they threatened the image of stable kingship. This selective preservation of memory leaves modern researchers with significant gaps. Archaeological discoveries reveal that Herakleopolis remained an active political and religious center throughout much of the First Intermediate period. Administrative institutions continued functioning, trade persisted, and local communities adapted to changing circumstances. These findings challenge older interpretations that portrayed the Northern Kingdom as little more than a period of decline. Even so, they tell us surprisingly little about Wahkare Khety himself. Some historians suggest that his reign represented one of the last serious attempts by the Herakleopolitan dynasty to maintain control before the growing power of Thebes shifted the balance permanently. Others argue that his influence may have been more limited than later literary traditions suggest, extending only across parts of northern Egypt while regional governors exercised considerable autonomy elsewhere. More speculative interpretations continue to emerge from the unanswered questions. Some independent researchers wonder whether undiscovered palace archives still lie buried beneath the ancient city of Herakleopolis, preserving correspondence between the king and provincial officials. Others suggest that autobiographical inscriptions belonging to high-ranking administrators may one day reveal details of his reign that royal monuments never recorded. A few have even proposed that later generations deliberately merged the achievements of several Khety rulers into a single literary figure, simplifying an already complex political history. If true, the king remembered today as Wahkare Khety may represent both a historical individual and a symbolic ideal shaped through centuries of copying and interpretation. Although such theories remain unverified, they illustrate the unusual position Wahkare Khety occupies within Egyptian history. He is neither entirely forgotten nor fully understood. His name survived. His words, or at least the words attributed to him, continued to be copied by generations of scribes. Yet the man himself remains remarkably distant. There is also the enduring mystery of Herakleopolis itself. Much of the ancient city still lies beneath modern settlements and deep archaeological layers. Compared with better-known Egyptian capitals, relatively little has been excavated. Every new discovery has the potential to reshape understanding of the First Intermediate Period, revealing administrative records, temple inscriptions, or royal monuments capable of illuminating rulers whose histories remain incomplete. Perhaps that possibility explains why Wahkare Khety continues to fascinate historians. He stands at the intersection of literature, politics, and archaeology, where surviving evidence preserves a thoughtful royal voice while withholding the details needed to understand the life behind it. The king who advised moderation, justice, and careful leadership may have governed during one of Egypt's most difficult eras, yet the events that shaped those lessons remain hidden behind damaged inscriptions and centuries of silence. Today, the quiet landscape of ancient Herakleopolis conceals more than buried walls and forgotten temples. Somewhere beneath its soil may rest the missing records of a ruler whose legacy survives not through towering monuments, but through questions that refuse to disappear. Until those missing pieces emerge, the mystery of King Wahkare Khety will continue to invite careful reflection, reminding us that some of history's most compelling figures are known not for the certainty they leave behind, but for the remarkable spaces where certainty ends and curiosity begins. If the story of Wahkare Khety reminds us how easily history can preserve a reputation while concealing the person behind it, the next mystery turns our attention away from kings and toward a man who never wore the crown, yet stood closer to power than almost anyone else in his generation. His words survive in remarkable detail. His achievements are carved into stone, and yet the final chapter of his career quietly disappears from the historical record. That man was Weni the Elder. The desert plateau at Abydos stretches into the distance beneath a pale morning sky. Rows of ancient tombs emerge from the limestone hills, their decorated walls still carrying the voices of officials who hoped to be remembered for eternity. One tomb, larger and more elaborate than many around it, belongs to a man who rose through nearly every level of Egypt's government. Its inscriptions are not filled with mythical tales or grand religious visions. Instead, they read almost like an autobiography, carefully recording promotions, responsibilities, military expeditions, and moments of extraordinary royal trust. Few non-royal Egyptians left behind such a detailed account of their own lives. The owner of that tomb was Weni the Elder. He lived during the 6th dynasty, around the 23rd century BC, serving under pharaohs Teti, Pepi I, and Merenre I. His career represents one of the most remarkable examples of social and political advancement in ancient Egypt. Beginning in relatively modest administrative positions, Weni steadily climbed through the royal bureaucracy until he became one of the kingdom's most influential officials. His own inscriptions describe this rise with unusual precision. He supervised royal expeditions into the eastern desert. He organized quarrying operations that supplied stone for monumental construction. He directed major engineering projects, including the transport of enormous blocks along the Nile. He led military campaigns into territories northeast of Egypt and managed complex logistical operations involving thousands of workers, soldiers, and officials. Most remarkably, Weni records that Pepi I entrusted him with investigating a confidential matter involving one of the king's queens. The passage remains one of the most intriguing texts from the Old Kingdom. According to Weni, the king appointed him to conduct the inquiry privately, accompanied by only a single judge. He proudly emphasizes that no high-ranking official had previously received such responsibility. The investigation, he writes, was completed discreetly and to the king's satisfaction. Then the inscription moves on. No names are revealed. No accusations are explained. No verdict is recorded. The silence surrounding that investigation has fascinated historians for generations. Yet another mystery receives far less attention. After decades of extraordinary influence, Weni himself seems to fade from Egypt's political landscape. His autobiography continues through the reign of Merenre I, describing prestigious assignments and successful expeditions. But beyond that point, the historical trail becomes unexpectedly quiet. The official who had stood among the kingdom's most trusted administrators simply disappears from the surviving record. What happened? The simplest explanation is also the least dramatic. Weni may simply have reached the end of his life after a long and distinguished career. Ancient Egyptian officials often prepared autobiographical tomb inscriptions before their deaths, selecting accomplishments they wished future generations to remember. His disappearance from royal affairs may reflect retirement, advancing age, or natural death rather than political misfortune. Many Egyptologists consider this the most likely interpretation. Yet several aspects of the evidence encourage closer examination. Weni's influence had become extraordinary. Few officials accumulated such wide-ranging responsibilities across multiple reigns. He investigated matters within the royal household, commanded military expeditions, supervised engineering projects, and maintained direct access to successive pharaohs. Men holding so much authority inevitably occupied delicate political positions. Power within the Egyptian court rarely remained static. Each new reign brought changing priorities, shifting alliances, and the promotion of different officials. Even trusted advisors could lose influence as younger administrators emerged, or new factions gained prominence within the palace. Could Weni have experienced such a transition? The surviving evidence neither confirms nor denies the possibility. His autobiography, like nearly all Egyptian self-presentations, focuses overwhelmingly on success. Ancient officials carved monuments celebrating promotions, honors, and royal favor. They almost never recorded failures, dismissals, or political disagreements. Silence itself often became the preferred way of ending an uncomfortable chapter. Some historians suggest that Weni's career simply concluded before major political changes unfolded during the later 6th dynasty. If he died during Merenre I's reign or shortly afterward, he would not have witnessed the increasingly complex circumstances surrounding Pepi II's exceptionally long rule. In this view, there is no mystery beyond the ordinary conclusion of a distinguished public career. Others find the timing intriguing. The Sixth Dynasty witnessed gradual shifts in the balance of power between the royal court and provincial elites. High officials accumulated increasing authority, regional governors strengthened their local influence, and administrative responsibilities became more widely distributed. As government evolved, even experienced officials may have found their positions changing. Was Weni gradually replaced by a new generation of administrators better suited to these changing circumstances? The historical record offers no direct answer. Another possibility involves the confidential investigation that made Weni famous. Although there is no evidence connecting it to his later disappearance, the assignment itself illustrates the sensitive political environment in which he operated. Investigating allegations involving a royal queen required exceptional trust, but it also placed Weni at the center of court politics. Did that investigation create lasting enemies? Were powerful families affected by its outcome? Did later political developments reshape relationships established during Pepi I's reign? Nothing in the surviving inscriptions supports these ideas directly. At the same time, the absence of detailed records makes them impossible to examine fully. Historians therefore approach such questions with considerable caution. Archaeological evidence provides additional perspective. Weni's tomb remained impressive, suggesting that he retained significant status at the end of his life. There is no indication that his monument suffered the deliberate destruction sometimes directed against disgraced officials. His name was not systematically erased. His inscriptions remained intact. His burial appears to have received appropriate care. These observations argue against the idea of dramatic political persecution. If Weni had fallen spectacularly from royal favor, clearer signs might reasonably be expected within the archaeological record. Still, political decline does not always leave visible scars. Influence can diminish gradually through changing appointments, evolving court dynamics, or the quiet rise of ambitious successors. An official need not experience formal disgrace to discover that his advice is sought less frequently than before. Some scholars therefore suggest that Weni's apparent disappearance reflects the natural transformation of Egypt's administration rather than personal failure. The centralized government of the early Old Kingdom gradually evolved into a more complex political system in which authority became increasingly shared among regional officials. In this interpretation, Weni's career represents both the height of centralized royal administration and the beginning of broader institutional change. There are also literary considerations. Autobiographical inscriptions followed established conventions. Their purpose was not to provide complete biographies in the modern sense, but to preserve ideal memories for eternity. Officials selected achievements that demonstrated loyalty, competence, and moral character. Events considered embarrassing, politically sensitive, or inconsistent with that image were simply omitted. This means historians cannot assume that Weni's inscription records every important moment of his career. Entire years may have passed without mention. Political disagreements, unsuccessful projects, or administrative setbacks could have occurred without leaving any trace in his carefully composed narrative. The limits of autobiography become part of the mystery itself. More speculative interpretations continue to circulate beyond mainstream scholarship. Some independent researchers imagine that Weni became entangled in factional disputes surrounding the royal succession after Pepi I. Others suggest that officials connected with competing branches of the royal family gradually displaced experienced administrators associated with earlier reigns. A few even wonder whether undiscovered papyrus archives once preserved correspondence revealing tensions inside the palace that official inscriptions deliberately concealed. These ideas remain entirely hypothetical. No archaeological evidence currently supports them, and mainstream Egyptology continues to emphasize the absence of direct proof. Even so, they demonstrate how naturally unanswered questions invite broader possibilities. Another intriguing aspect concerns Weni's military responsibilities.
If the career of Weni the Elder reveals how political influence can quietly fade, despite a lifetime of remarkable service, the next mystery returns us to the battlefield, where another figure spent much of his reign struggling for a goal that always seemed just beyond reach. Unlike rulers remembered for swift victories, Intef II devoted decades to a conflict that remained unresolved for most of his life. His persistence reshaped Egypt's future, yet historians continue to ask the same question: why did the fighting last so long? The cliffs west of Thebes cast long shadows across the Nile as the first light of dawn reaches the river. Below them, narrow fields of grain border the fertile floodplain before giving way to the dry limestone hills. Ancient watchposts once overlooked these valleys, while small fortresses guarded strategic crossings where soldiers, merchants, and royal messengers passed between Upper and Middle Egypt. The landscape appears peaceful today, but more than 4,000 years ago, it marked the frontier of a kingdom locked in a struggle that would span generations. During the First Intermediate Period, Egypt was no longer governed by a single unquestioned ruler. The centralized authority that had defined the Old Kingdom had weakened, allowing regional powers to emerge across the Nile Valley. In the north, the rulers of Herakleopolis claimed the throne through the 9th and 10th dynasties. In the south, the growing city of Thebes became the center of the 11th dynasty. Between these rival kingdoms lay territories where loyalty often shifted according to local circumstances rather than distant royal claims. It was into this divided world that Intef II became king. Generally dated to the early 21st century BC, Intef II ruled for an exceptionally long period, often estimated at nearly 50 years. His reign was marked not by a single decisive conquest, but by an extended campaign to strengthen Theban authority while gradually pushing northward against competing powers. By the time his reign ended, Thebes had expanded considerably, yet Egypt remained divided. Complete reunification would not occur until the reign of his successor's son, Mentuhotep II. This raises one of the most intriguing questions of the First Intermediate Period. Why did Intef II fight for so many years without achieving final victory? The simplest explanation begins with geography. The Nile united Egypt, but it also created natural defensive positions. Control of key river crossings, fortified settlements, and fertile agricultural regions determined political power. Every advance required securing supply lines, maintaining communication, and ensuring the loyalty of communities along the route. Capturing territory was one challenge. Holding it against counterattacks was another entirely. Military campaigns therefore unfolded slowly. Rather than massive battles deciding the fate of kingdoms in a single season, evidence suggests repeated operations spread across many years. Provincial governors, local military commanders, and influential families often determined whether a region supported Thebes, Herakleopolis, or attempted to remain independent altogether. Intef II was therefore fighting not simply against one rival king, but against an entire political landscape that constantly evolved. The inscriptions he left behind provide valuable, though incomplete, evidence. Several monuments celebrate victories over neighboring territories and describe the expansion of Theban influence. One inscription records that his authority extended northward as his armies secured important regions along the Nile. These texts clearly portray a confident ruler steadily enlarging his kingdom. Yet they remain selective. Like most Egyptian royal inscriptions, they emphasize success while saying very little about setbacks, stalemates, or campaigns that failed to achieve their objectives. Historians must therefore reconstruct the broader picture from archaeology, regional inscriptions, and the changing political boundaries suggested by later evidence. One widely accepted interpretation proposes that Intef II deliberately pursued a gradual strategy. Instead of risking everything in a single ambitious campaign, he appears to have consolidated each newly acquired territory before advancing farther north. Fortifying settlements, establishing administrative control, appointing loyal governors, and securing agricultural production would have strengthened his kingdom over time. Such an approach demanded patience. Rapid expansion without stable administration could easily have collapsed once armies withdrew. In this view, Intef II's lengthy military efforts reflected careful state-building rather than military hesitation. Another important factor was the strength of his opponents. Herakleopolis remained a capable political center throughout much of Intef II's reign. Archaeological evidence indicates continued administrative activity, religious construction, and economic organization in the north. Contrary to older assumptions, the northern kingdom was not simply disintegrating while Thebes advanced unopposed. Both kingdoms possessed resources, experienced officials, and regional supporters. Neither side enjoyed overwhelming superiority. This balance of power helps explain why the conflict persisted across decades. Some historians also emphasize the importance of local alliances. Egypt, during the first intermediate period, was shaped not only by kings, but by provincial governors known as nomarchs. These regional leaders controlled agricultural wealth, labor forces, and local security. Their loyalty could change according to political circumstances, economic interests, or family relationships. Winning their support often proved more valuable than winning a battlefield. Intef II may therefore have spent years negotiating, rewarding, and integrating local elites into the expanding Theban state. Such diplomacy rarely leaves dramatic archaeological evidence, yet it may have played a decisive role in the kingdom's gradual growth. The duration of the conflict also raises questions about logistics. Supplying armies across hundreds of miles required enormous administrative coordination. Grain had to be collected, transported, and distributed. Weapons needed to be produced and repaired. Boats carried provisions along the Nile, while officials maintained communication between military commanders and the royal court. Campaigns could only continue as long as the kingdom itself remained stable. Intef II appears to have understood this relationship well. His reign witnessed not only military activity, but also investment in royal monuments, administrative organization, and religious institutions. These developments suggest that warfare formed only one part of a broader effort to strengthen Thebes internally while expanding externally. Could this explain why progress seemed measured rather than dramatic? Many Egyptologists believe so. The ruler was building a kingdom capable of lasting beyond immediate victories. His greatest achievement may not have been territory captured during his own lifetime, but the stable political foundation inherited by Intef III and later Mentuhotep II. Still, important mysteries remain. Several campaigns mentioned in inscriptions cannot be reconstructed with certainty because the surviving texts are damaged or incomplete. We know victories occurred, but not always where, against whom, or under what circumstances. Were there major defeats that royal inscriptions deliberately ignored? Did temporary truces interrupt the fighting? Were negotiations taking place alongside military operations? The available evidence leaves each of these questions open. Ancient Egyptian monuments rarely admitted failure. Kings presented themselves as protectors of order whose victories reflected divine favor. Defeats, political compromises, or strategic withdrawals seldom appeared in official inscriptions. As a result, historians often encounter long periods during which important events almost certainly occurred but remain undocumented. Another fascinating aspect concerns the psychological dimension of leadership. Intef II ruled for nearly half a century in an environment of continual uncertainty. Every campaign carried risks. Every alliance required maintenance. Every territorial gain demanded protection. How did such prolonged responsibility shape the decisions of a ruler? Although ancient sources cannot answer directly, the endurance of his reign suggests remarkable political resilience. Unlike rulers whose kingdoms collapsed after brief periods of instability, Intef II maintained authority while steadily strengthening his position over decades. This stability alone distinguishes him from many contemporaries. Some researchers have suggested that the conflict itself evolved over time. Rather than one continuous war, it may have consisted of alternating phases of campaigning, diplomacy, economic competition, and local disputes. Border regions could experience years of relative calm before renewed tensions emerged. If this interpretation is correct, the phrase "fought so long" describes not uninterrupted warfare, but an extended political contest involving many different forms of power. More speculative theories naturally arise where evidence grows scarce. Some independent researchers argue that additional rival rulers operated between Thebes and Herakleopolis, complicating the struggle far beyond the traditional picture of two opposing kingdoms. Others suggest that environmental pressures, including fluctuations in Nile flooding and agricultural production, influenced military decisions more strongly than surviving inscriptions reveal. If Intef II's long struggle reminds us that history often rewards patience more than sudden victory, the next mystery introduces a ruler remembered for a very different reason. His name has survived not because of magnificent monuments or celebrated reforms, but because of stories that portray him as ruthless, unstable, and feared even by his own people. Yet, as with so many figures from Egypt's first intermediate period, separating historical fact from centuries of legend is far more difficult than it first appears. The low mounds of ancient Herakleopolis stretch quietly across the Nile floodplain, their buried walls hidden beneath layers of earth deposited over thousands of years. Broken temple blocks lie scattered among fragments of pottery and weathered limestone, while the outlines of forgotten streets remain concealed beneath modern fields. Little in this peaceful landscape suggests that it once served as the capital of kings who challenged Thebes for control of Egypt. Fewer still would imagine that one of those rulers became the subject of one of the most unsettling traditions in all of Egyptian history. That king is often identified as Akhtoy, more commonly rendered by Egyptologists as Khety. Almost immediately, the mystery begins. The name Akhtoy, or Khety, was shared by several rulers of the 9th and 10th dynasties during the First Intermediate Period, around the 22nd and 21st centuries BC. Because surviving records are incomplete, historians cannot always determine which king is being described in later texts. Some inscriptions preserve only fragments of royal names, while king lists compiled centuries afterward sometimes disagree about the sequence of rulers. As a result, the violent reputation attached to King Akhtoy may refer to one individual, several different kings, or even a legendary figure shaped by generations of storytelling. The best-known account comes from the Egyptian priest Manetho, who wrote during the 3rd century BC, nearly 2,000 years after the First Intermediate Period itself. Although his original history of Egypt has not survived, portions were quoted by later writers. In one passage, Manetho describes a king of Herakleopolis, usually identified as Akhtoy or Khety, as an exceptionally cruel ruler who oppressed the people of Egypt before eventually descending into madness. According to the tradition, his life ended in a dramatic and almost symbolic manner when he was killed by a crocodile. It is an unforgettable story, but did it actually happen? Most Egyptologists approach Manetho's account with considerable caution. The enormous gap between the events and the surviving record makes direct verification impossible. By the time Manetho wrote, Egypt had already experienced centuries of political change, foreign rule, and evolving historical traditions. Stories passed from one generation to another often became embellished, simplified, or reshaped to communicate moral lessons rather than precise historical facts. This possibility becomes especially important when examining rulers from the first intermediate period. Later, Egyptian writers frequently portrayed that era as a time of disorder, political division, and weakened royal authority before the restoration of unity under the Middle Kingdom. Such narratives naturally emphasize the contrast between instability and later renewal. Within that framework, a cruel or unstable king could become a powerful literary symbol, representing the collapse of proper rule. If so, Akhtoy's fearsome reputation may tell us as much about later Egyptian ideas concerning kingship as it does about the historical individual himself. The archaeological evidence paints a far less dramatic picture. Herakleopolis remained an active political and religious center throughout much of the 9th and 10th dynasties. Excavations reveal continued administration, temple activity, craft production, and regional trade. Although Egypt was politically divided, life did not simply descend into complete chaos. Communities continued farming, building, worshiping, and governing themselves under local authorities. This continuity raises an important question. Could an extraordinarily violent ruler truly have maintained power over such a functioning kingdom? Some historians argue that even if Akhtoy possessed a harsh personality, later traditions almost certainly exaggerated his behavior. Ancient monarchs throughout the Near East occasionally employed military force to suppress rebellions or defend territory. Such actions, while severe by modern standards, were often presented as necessary aspects of kingship. Over centuries, those memories could easily grow into stories portraying exceptional cruelty. Another possibility involves political propaganda. The rulers of Herakleopolis ultimately lost their struggle against Thebes. When Mentuhotep II reunified Egypt, official memory naturally favored the victorious dynasty. Although there is no direct evidence that Theban scribes deliberately invented stories about Akhtoy, history repeatedly demonstrates that defeated rulers are often remembered less kindly than those who triumph. Negative traditions may therefore have accumulated gradually as later generations interpreted the first intermediate period through the perspective of reunification. There is another intriguing detail. The alleged madness of Akhtoy occupies a central place in Manetho's account. Mental instability appears in ancient literature not only as a medical condition, but also as a moral and religious symbol. A king who abandoned justice might be portrayed as losing divine favor, resulting in irrational behavior that reflected cosmic disorder. In this sense, madness represented the opposite of Maat, the Egyptian ideal of balance, harmony, and rightful rule. The crocodile itself may carry similar symbolic meaning. Throughout Egyptian religion, crocodiles inspired both fear and reverence. They were associated with the god Sobek, whose complex nature embodied strength, fertility, military power, and the dangerous unpredictability of the Nile. A king destroyed by a crocodile may therefore represent more than a literal death. The image could symbolize divine judgment, nature reclaiming authority, or the inevitable downfall of a ruler who violated sacred principles. Whether the event occurred exactly as described remains impossible to determine. No contemporary inscription mentions such a death. No archaeological discovery confirms the story. No surviving court record describes the king's final days. The tale survives only through much later historical tradition, Yet, dismissing it entirely may also overlook something important. Legends often preserve faint echoes of genuine events. A ruler remembered for unusual severity could gradually become the central figure in increasingly dramatic stories. An unexpected death near the Nile might evolve into an account involving a crocodile. Political turmoil could become personalized through the image of one unforgettable monarch. The original facts, if they ever existed, may now be impossible to recover. Another mystery concerns the identity of Akhtoy himself. Several kings bearing the name Khety ruled during the 9th and 10th dynasties. Among them were rulers who likely governed for different lengths of time under varying political circumstances. Damaged monuments and incomplete king lists make precise identification extraordinarily difficult. Some Egyptologists suggest that the violent traditions became attached to the wrong king during later centuries. Others argue that multiple rulers gradually merged into a single legendary character. If this happened, the historical Akhtoy may have been far less remarkable than the figure preserved in literary memory. The political realities of the period also deserve consideration. The first intermediate period was characterized by competing kingdoms, shifting regional alliances, and occasional military conflict. Maintaining authority required balancing powerful provincial governors while defending territory against rival dynasties. Such conditions inevitably demanded difficult decisions. Military campaigns, tax collection, suppression of local rebellions, appointment of loyal officials. Any ruler navigating these challenges risked earning both admiration and resentment, depending upon the perspective of those recording events. Could Akhtoy's later reputation reflect controversial but politically necessary actions rather than extraordinary brutality? It remains one possibility among many. Some historians point toward literary works such as the Instruction for King Merenre, often associated with the Herakleopolitan court. This text emphasizes moderation, justice, restraint, and careful treatment of subjects. If it genuinely reflects the political philosophy of the dynasty, it presents an interesting contrast. Would a kingdom supposedly governed by an infamous tyrant later produce one of ancient Egypt's most thoughtful discussions of responsible leadership? Perhaps. Or perhaps the advice was written precisely because earlier rulers had demonstrated the dangers of excessive force. The evidence allows both interpretations. More speculative ideas continue to circulate outside mainstream scholarship. Some independent researchers suggest that Akhtoy became the target of deliberate character assassination after the Theban victory, his image reshaped to justify the reunification of Egypt under a new dynasty. Others wonder whether undiscovered inscriptions still buried beneath Herakleopolis could preserve the northern court's own account of his reign. The entrance to Merenre I's pyramid rises from the sands of South Saqqara, surrounded by weathered limestone blocks that once formed part of a grand royal complex. Time has stripped away much of its original brilliance, leaving only fragments of polished casing stones and scattered architectural remains. Nearby, the dry desert air preserves inscriptions carved more than 4,000 years ago, recording ceremonies, expeditions, and royal achievements. The monument stands as evidence that Merenre I was an active and respected king. Yet, for all the stone that survives, it reveals remarkably little about why his reign ended so unexpectedly. Merenre I ruled during Egypt's 6th dynasty, around the 23rd century BC, succeeding his father, Pepi I. Although his reign is generally estimated to have lasted somewhere between 5 and 11 years, depending on how surviving king lists and inscriptions are interpreted, it was noticeably shorter than those of both his predecessor and his successor. Pepi I ruled for decades, while Pepi II would eventually become one of the longest reigning monarchs in recorded history. Merenre I's comparatively brief time on the throne has therefore attracted considerable attention. What makes the mystery especially intriguing is that his reign does not appear unsuccessful. Surviving inscriptions indicate that Egypt remained politically stable. Trade expeditions continued into distant regions. Quarrying operations supplied stone for royal construction projects, while officials carried out large administrative works throughout the kingdom. One of Merenre's most trusted servants, Weni the Elder, described organizing major expeditions under the king's authority, including ambitious missions to transport enormous stone blocks along the Nile for construction. Another senior official, Harkuf, undertook famous expeditions deep into Nubia, expanding trade and diplomatic relations far beyond Egypt's southern frontier. His autobiographical inscriptions describe journeys lasting many months, bringing valuable goods and establishing peaceful relationships with local rulers. These achievements suggest that Merenre inherited a functioning administration and maintained it effectively. Nothing in the surviving evidence points toward immediate political collapse. His pyramid complex also reflects confidence rather than uncertainty. Although smaller than some earlier royal monuments, it demonstrates that construction continued according to established Old Kingdom traditions. Religious ceremonies, administrative offices, and royal building programs all appear to have remained active throughout his reign. Why, then, was his rule so brief? The simplest explanation is natural death. Life expectancy in the ancient world was unpredictable, and even pharaohs remained vulnerable to disease, infection, accidents, and medical conditions that modern science can often treat successfully. Without surviving medical records or securely identified human remains that provide definitive evidence, historians generally consider natural causes the most likely explanation. One fascinating detail has contributed to this discussion. A mummy discovered in the 19th century was at one time identified as Merenre I. If that identification were correct, it would represent one of the oldest surviving royal mummies ever recovered. Early examinations suggested the individual may have died at a relatively young age. However, modern Egyptologists remain cautious. The identification is uncertain, and some scholars question whether the mummy truly belongs to Merenre I at all. Because of this uncertainty, it cannot reliably answer questions about the king's age, health, or cause of death. The mystery therefore remains unresolved. Another possibility concerns hereditary illness. Royal families often practiced marriages within a limited circle of elite relatives to preserve dynastic continuity. Some researchers have wondered whether genetic conditions may occasionally have affected members of the royal household, shortening the lives of certain rulers. At present, however, there is no direct evidence linking Merenre I to any specific hereditary disorder. Without confirmed remains or detailed medical information, such ideas remain speculative. Political explanations have also been considered. The 6th dynasty was a period of growing administrative complexity. Provincial governors were gradually becoming more influential, while senior officials accumulated increasing authority throughout the kingdom. Although Merenre's reign appears stable, historians recognize that political tensions sometimes develop long before they become visible in surviving records. Could internal rivalries have played a role? No contemporary inscription suggests assassination, rebellion, or palace intrigue during Merenre's reign. Unlike the better-known palace conspiracy associated with Pepi I, or the literary tradition surrounding Amenemhat I, there is no surviving account describing violence against Merenre himself. Nevertheless, official Egyptian inscriptions rarely recorded political crises unless doing so served a clear ideological purpose. If difficulties emerged behind palace walls, they might never have appeared on royal monuments intended to celebrate order and stability. Some scholars instead focus on succession. Merenre was followed by Pepi II, who inherited the throne while still a child according to the traditional interpretation. If this chronology is correct, Merenre's unexpected death would have placed enormous responsibility upon experienced officials serving as advisors during the early years of the new reign. This transition appears to have occurred successfully. Government continued functioning. Major expeditions resumed. Administrative institutions remained intact. Such continuity argues against a violent collapse and instead suggests that Egypt's bureaucracy possessed remarkable resilience even during an unexpected change of ruler. Still, one question lingers. If Merenre died suddenly, why do no surviving inscriptions acknowledge the event? Part of the answer lies within Egyptian royal tradition. Kings were viewed not simply as political leaders, but as guarantors of Maat, the sacred balance that sustained the universe. Publicly emphasizing weakness, uncertainty, or unexplained death conflicted with this ideal. Royal monuments therefore celebrated continuity rather than vulnerability. Silence became a form of political stability. Archaeology offers only limited additional clues. Merenre's pyramid was completed sufficiently for burial, suggesting that preparations proceeded without major interruption. His funerary complex followed established architectural patterns, indicating that officials responsible for royal burial carried out their duties efficiently. Had the king died amid severe political upheaval, historians might expect evidence of abandoned construction or disrupted funerary arrangements. Instead, the available evidence reflects careful organization. Some researchers therefore argue that Merenre's reign was not cut short by crisis, but simply by unfortunate timing. A capable ruler may have died unexpectedly from entirely ordinary causes, leaving behind a kingdom strong enough to continue functioning without immediate disruption. Yet, uncertainty persists because so much evidence has disappeared. Administrative papyri from the royal court have almost entirely vanished. Medical records, if they existed, have not survived. Correspondence between palace officials may still lie buried beneath ancient settlements, or may have decayed long ago. Entire chapters of the Old Kingdom's history are known only through inscriptions carved into stone, and those inscriptions were never intended to provide complete biographies. More speculative theories naturally emerge where documentation becomes scarce. Some independent researchers have suggested that Merenre may have died while traveling, perhaps during an inspection of distant provinces or while overseeing one of the kingdom's major expeditions. Others wonder whether an epidemic affecting members of the royal household escaped historical notice because official records deliberately emphasized continuity over tragedy. A few have even proposed that future excavations around South Saqqara may uncover overlooked administrative buildings containing records from the final years of his reign. At present, none of these possibilities can be confirmed. They remain thoughtful attempts to explain a historical silence rather than conclusions supported by direct evidence. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of Merenre's story is the contrast between activity and brevity. During his comparatively short reign, Egypt remained engaged in diplomacy, trade, construction, military organization, and exploration. Officials such as Weni and Harkuf carried out ambitious projects requiring careful planning and royal support. The machinery of government functioned with impressive efficiency. Nothing suggests a kingdom in decline. Yet, the king himself disappears from history almost as quickly as he arrived. Today, the weathered stones of Merenre's pyramid still rise above the desert at South Saqqara, preserving the memory of a ruler whose accomplishments exceeded the length of his reign. The inscriptions carved by loyal officials continue to celebrate expeditions, engineering achievements, and royal authority. But they remain almost entirely silent about the event that ended it all. Somewhere beneath Egypt's sands, another inscription, an overlooked burial chamber, or a forgotten archive may still preserve the missing explanation. Until that evide.
The morning sun casts a warm glow across the ancient necropolis of Saqqara, where weathered limestone monuments rise from the desert in silent rows. Among the royal pyramids and elaborate tombs lies the burial complex of Queen Iput I, a place that once reflected both prestige and sacred authority. Though smaller than the monuments built for kings, its decorated chambers and carefully planned architecture reveal that this was no ordinary burial. Every carved inscription, every offering niche, and every fragment of relief hints at a woman who stood at the very heart of Egypt's royal family during one of the Old Kingdom's most important dynasties. Yet despite these impressive remains, Queen Iput I remains one of the least understood figures of the 6th dynasty. Most Egyptologists identify Iput I as the principal wife of Pharaoh Teti, the founder of the 6th dynasty, and the mother of Pepi I, one of Egypt's most successful Old Kingdom rulers. Her burial complex at Saqqara confirms her exceptional status through prestigious royal titles, including King's Mother, a designation that carried enormous political and ceremonial importance in ancient Egypt. At first glance, her role appears straightforward. She was a queen. She became the mother of a future king. She received a royal burial worthy of her position. But the closer historians examine the surviving evidence, the more complicated the picture becomes. The 6th dynasty began during a period of political transition. Although Teti successfully established a new royal line after the 5th dynasty, dynastic changes often required careful management of competing noble families, regional elites, and members of the royal household. Maintaining legitimacy was not simply a matter of inheritance. It also depended upon alliances, influential marriages, and the public presentation of royal continuity. Within this political landscape, queens could play roles that extended well beyond ceremonial duties. Unlike many earlier periods, the 6th dynasty offers growing evidence that royal women occupied increasingly visible positions within court life. Their titles expanded, their burial complexes became more elaborate, and their connections to the succession received greater emphasis. Rather than existing only in the background, queens often became essential figures in preserving dynastic stability. This context has led historians to ask an important question. Was Iput I merely the mother of Pepi I, or did she actively shape the transition that secured his place upon the throne? Direct evidence remains limited. No surviving inscription records her giving political advice, issuing decrees, or participating openly in government. Ancient Egyptian royal monuments generally focused on kings, leaving the contributions of queens only partially visible. Their influence often operated through family relationships, religious authority, and ceremonial roles that official inscriptions rarely described in detail. Even so, the surviving clues are difficult to ignore. Iput I's burial complex received considerable attention, suggesting that her position remained highly respected long after Teti's reign ended. Archaeological discoveries within her pyramid complex include finely decorated chambers and inscriptions emphasizing her royal identity. Such investment reflects more than simple family affection. It indicates that preserving her memory carried political as well as religious importance. One reason may lie in Pepi I's succession. The early years of the 6th dynasty were not entirely free from uncertainty. Ancient sources describe a conspiracy during Pepi I's reign involving one of his queens, investigated by the official Weni the Elder. Although this event occurred later and has no known connection to Iput Weni herself, it reminds historians that palace politics could become highly sensitive. If the royal household contained competing interests during Pepi I's reign, similar tensions may also have existed during the transition following Teti's death. Could Queen Iput have acted as a stabilizing figure during that uncertain period? Many historians believe the possibility deserves consideration. As the mother of the heir, she occupied a uniquely important position within the royal family. Her prestige may have strengthened Pepi I's legitimacy, particularly if influential officials or noble families questioned aspects of the succession. In many ancient monarchies, the king's mother held ceremonial authority capable of reinforcing political continuity during moments of transition. Although direct documentation is absent, this interpretation aligns with broader patterns observed throughout Egyptian history. Another intriguing aspect concerns Iput I's ancestry. Some scholars have proposed that she may have belonged to an influential noble family connected to the preceding 5th dynasty. If true, her marriage to Teti could have helped unite competing branches of Egypt's elite during the establishment of the new dynasty. Such dynastic marriages were common political tools throughout the ancient world, strengthening legitimacy through carefully arranged family alliances. The evidence, however, remains incomplete. No surviving inscription clearly identifies her parents, leaving historians unable to confirm her precise family background with certainty. This uncertainty has encouraged several competing theories. One interpretation suggests that Iput I's importance lay primarily in her role as dynastic bridge, linking older royal traditions with the emerging 6th dynasty. Another argues that her significance increased only after Pepi I secured the throne, when the title King's Mother elevated her public prestige far beyond that of an ordinary queen. Neither explanation can currently be proven. The architecture of her pyramid complex also invites careful study. Although modest compared with the Great Pyramids of earlier dynasties, it reflects changing royal funerary traditions during the Old Kingdom. Decorative elements emphasize religious symbolism, while the arrangement of the burial chambers illustrates the growing importance of royal women within state ideology. Some Egyptologists believe these developments indicate that queens enjoyed expanding ceremonial influence during the 6th dynasty. Others caution that architectural changes alone cannot reveal political authority. Monuments celebrate status, but they rarely explain how that status functioned within everyday government. There is another mystery hidden within the silence of the inscriptions. Ancient Egyptian queens undoubtedly influenced court life through personal relationships, religious patronage, and the upbringing of future rulers. Yet official records seldom describe these activities directly. Their contributions remain visible only indirectly through titles, monuments, and the achievements of those around them. As a result, historians often encounter a paradox. The more important a queen may have been within private royal life, the less explicitly her influence appears in surviving inscriptions. Some researchers therefore suggest that Iput I exercised considerable informal authority inside the palace, advising trusted officials and helping maintain continuity during moments of political uncertainty. Such ideas remain speculative. No contemporary document records private conversations or court deliberations involving the queen. Still, anyone standing at the center of the royal family during the foundation of a new dynasty almost certainly occupied a position of exceptional influence, even if that influence left few written traces. More speculative theories extend even further. Some independent researchers wonder whether administrative papyri, still undiscovered beneath the sands of Saqqara, might one day reveal correspondence mentioning Iput I in matters of estate management or palace administration. Others imagine that additional chambers within nearby elite tombs may preserve references to ceremonies or political events in which she participated. At present, these possibilities remain entirely hypothetical. Yet archaeology continues to reshape understanding of royal women with every new excavation. Over the past century, discoveries have repeatedly demonstrated that queens occupied more complex positions than earlier historians once believed. Titles once regarded as purely ceremonial now appear connected with religious institutions, economic estates, and dynastic legitimacy. In this broader context, Iput Weni becomes even more intriguing. She lived at the beginning of one of Egypt's longest-lasting royal dynasties. She gave birth to a ruler whose reign strengthened the kingdom for decades. She received one of the most prestigious burials ever constructed for a royal woman of her era. And yet, the personal story behind these accomplishments remains almost entirely hidden. Today, visitors walking through the ancient necropolis of Saqqara see only weathered stone, restored walls, and the quiet entrances to burial chambers carved more than 4,000 years ago. The monuments preserve Queen Iput Weni's name with remarkable clarity, but they reveal almost nothing about her voice, her decisions, or the relationships that may have shaped Egypt's future from within the royal palace. Somewhere beneath the sands surrounding her pyramid, another inscription, an overlooked administrative archive, or the forgotten tomb of a court official may still contain the missing pieces of her story. Until then, the true role of Queen Iput remains suspended between certainty and possibility, inviting us to wonder whether one of the 6th dynasty's most influential figures